I built my empire from bare hands and borrowed hope only to be reduced to nothing at my own table. On Easter Sunday, my son pounded his fist into the mahogany and called me useless. His wife didn't hesitate. She smiled, lifted her glass, and sent red wine across my face. They saw a frail old man, a relic, someone too tired to respond. They mistook silence for surrender. I didn't argue. I didn't flinch. I walked out, slid behind the wheel, and sent 3 words to my attorney. 20 minutes later, federal agents shattered the illusion they built inside my house. I'm truly grateful you're here with me. Before we go any further, tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I love seeing how far these stories reach. And if you believe disrespect should have consequences, make sure you're subscribed. Also, a quick note, parts of this story are dramatized for impact and education. Any similarities to actual people or places are purely coincidental, but the lesson behind it still matters. My name is Alaric Vaughn. In the freight world, most people call me Dez. I'm 73 years old. 4 decades ago, armed with nothing but a second-hand flatbed truck, a mountain of unpaid bills, and a promise to my late wife Yvonne, I built Vaughn Logistics into one of the most profitable freight operations on the East Coast. We didn't inherit wealth. We didn't have powerful connections. We had grit, long nights, diesel fumes, and loyalty to the men who drove for us. But when Yvonne passed away 5 years ago, something inside me dimmed. I stepped away from the daily grind and handed control of the company to our only son, Spencer. I believed I was passing the torch to a disciplined, honorable man who respected the legacy his mother and I sacrificed to build. Instead, I handed a kingdom to a boy obsessed with wearing the crown. Spencer is 40 now, but he carries himself like a spoiled teenager chasing approval. He married Delilah, 35, raised in a country club family that wore status like perfume while their finances quietly crumbled. They had fading prestige. My son had real money, and he was desperate for their validation. It was the perfect storm. Delilah and her family treated subtle condescension like a sport mocking my background, my wardrobe, even the way I held a fork. To them, I was just an aging black man who didn't belong in their polished world. For 8 months I played along. I let my hands tremble. I faked forgetfulness. I slurred my words. I needed them comfortable careless while I watched them siphon millions from my company. It erupted on Easter Sunday at my table, in the mansion I paid for in cash. I reached for my water, let my hand shake violently, and knocked my silver fork onto the stone floor. The fork struck the imported stone floor with a sharp metallic crack that echoed through the vast dining room. Conversation died instantly. The silence was thick, almost ceremonial. Delilah released an exaggerated sigh, rolling her eyes with theatrical irritation. Her mother, Susan, leaned toward Richard and muttered something beneath her breath, shaking her head as if I were an embarrassment on display. Chad smirked, glancing down at his luxury watch, as though my clumsiness had inconvenienced his schedule. Then Spencer slammed his palm against the table so violently the crystal glasses trembled. "You are useless," he barked, his face flushed with anger. "You can't even hold a fork. You're destroying the company. You're destroying my reputation. And now, you're ruining my dinner." I looked at my son, the boy I had worked endless nights for, the child Yvonne loved beyond measure, and I saw no trace of him. In his place stood a stranger wearing my blood, but none of my values. Then Delilah laughed. It was not nervous laughter. It was sharp, deliberate, cruel. She lifted her heavy crystal glass filled with dark red wine, and with casual precision flicked it across the table. The liquid hit my face and chest in one cold splash, stinging my eyes and soaking into my shirt. A soft gasp rippled through the room, but no one moved to stop her. The shirt she ruined wasn't just fabric. It was pale blue linen Yvonne had bought me during our final anniversary by the coast, one of the last tangible pieces of her I still carried. The wine spread across my chest like a bleeding stain. They waited for me to explode, to shout, to crumble like a confused old man. I did none of it. I removed my wire-rimmed glasses slowly. I wiped my face carefully with my napkin. I folded it and placed it beside my plate. I stood pushed in my chair and held Spencer's gaze for one steady second. He looked away first. Without a word, I turned and walked out of the room. The evening air outside was cool and crisp. I reached my old SUV at the edge of the driveway and sat behind the wheel. I wiped the final trace of wine from my chin, feeling the cold dampness against my skin. Then I pulled out my phone and opened a secure thread with my senior corporate attorney, Kendrick. 3 words. It is time. I pressed send. Moments later, distant sirens began to rise in the night. I drove 1 block down and parked beneath the shadow of a massive oak tree. I killed the engine, but left the windows down. The scent of jasmine drifted in with the wind. I let the wine soak deeper into the linen. I wanted to feel it to remember exactly why this was happening. I looked into the rearview mirror. My hands were steady. The tremors I had displayed minutes earlier were gone because they had never existed. For 8 months, I had performed the role of a declining patriarch, shaky hands, wandering memory-slurred speech. Arrogant thieves never suspect the man they think is fading. Late last summer, I began reviewing the quarterly financial reports again. Vaughn Logistics was built from a single rusted truck, and my name still stood on that building. I had promised Yvonne I would protect what we built. The discrepancies were subtle at first: inflated vendor invoices, fuel charges without freight movement, routing logs that didn't add up, small cracks in the foundation. But I had built empires by studying cracks. I discreetly retained a brilliant forensic accountant completely off the books. What she uncovered was not minor misconduct. It was a financial massacre. Spencer and Delilah weren't skimming pocket change to sustain their country club image. They were draining Vaughn Logistics at the source. Through layered shell corporations, fabricated vendor accounts, and offshore funnels, they redirected millions in corporate revenue into private trusts and luxury real estate holdings. They had converted my life's work into their personal vault. While they paraded in designer labels and chartered vacations, loyal drivers were being laid off. Mechanics who had stood beside me for decades saw their health benefits slashed. 500 families depended on that company. I could have stormed into the boardroom and terminated Spencer on the spot. I could have buried it quietly as a family disgrace. But federal fraud isn't a private disagreement. When you siphon millions and falsify financial records, you endanger the entire enterprise. I needed a case so airtight that the government would sever him from the corporation without hesitation. So I continued the performance. I let Delilah mock me. I let Richard sneer at my background. I allowed them to treat me as an aging inconvenience. And while they laughed, I collected everything, every wire transfer, every falsified invoice, every digital breadcrumb. I delivered the complete dossier to my attorney, Kendrick. He carried it straight into the regional office of the FBI. I glanced at the glowing clock on my dashboard. 19 minutes since I texted him. It is time. The trap had been set long before Easter dinner. The fork was theater. The wine was confirmation. There was no son left to save only a criminal seated at my table. A flicker of grief passed through me for the boy he once was. Then it was gone. The sirens in the distance abruptly fell silent. That's protocol. Agents cut the noise blocks away to prevent suspects from destroying evidence or fleeing. Through my windshield, I watched 4 matte black tactical SUVs glide around the corner without headlights. They moved like silent predators. The vehicles swerved into the circular driveway, sealing every exit and boxing in the luxury cars belonging to Delilah's family. Doors flew open before the engines fully stopped. More than a dozen agents stepped into the night tactical vests marked boldly with FBI and IRS. They did not knock. 2 agents advanced with a steel battering ram. The explosive crack of oak and reinforced glass split the air as the mansion doors gave way. Within seconds, chaos consumed the foyer. Commands were shouted. Bodies were ordered to the floor. Delilah's shrill screams pierced the night. Chairs overturned. Crystal shattered across imported stone. And I sat beneath the oak tree steady and silent as justice walked through my front door. The elegant Easter dinner had transformed into a federal crime scene in less than 10 minutes. Porch lights flicked on up and down the manicured street. Dogs barked behind white fences. Curtains shifted as neighbors peeked into the flashing red and blue glow washing over my driveway. I remained seated in the dark interior of my SUV, watching everything unfold with perfect stillness. A few minutes later, the shattered front doors swung open again. 2 broad-shouldered federal agents emerged, gripping a man between them. Spencer. His tailored suit jacket hung torn at the shoulder. His hands were wrenched behind his back, locked in steel cuffs. He stumbled over splintered wood and broken glass scattered across the porch. The man who had pounded his fist on my table and called me useless now wore pure terror on his face. The self-proclaimed corporate king was sobbing like a frightened boy. He scanned the driveway wildly, taking in the silent rotation of emergency lights, reflecting off badges and tactical vests. Then his eyes found my SUV parked beneath the oak tree. He tried to dig his heels into the driveway. "Dad!" he screamed, his voice cracking as it echoed down the quiet block. "Dad, please tell them to stop. I'm sorry about the wine. I'm sorry Delilah threw it. Tell them it was just a family argument. Tell them it was a misunderstanding. Dad, please." I rolled up my window slowly, sealing out the desperation. He truly believed this was about a stained shirt. He thought I had called local police over a disrespectful dinner. His arrogance blinded him to the truth. The agents forcing him into the transport vehicle were not there for domestic drama. They were there for wire fraud, money laundering, and tax evasion. He had no idea he was staring at 2 decades inside a federal penitentiary. The operation was flawless. I shifted into gear and drove away from the spectacle of flashing lights. But the handcuffs were only the beginning. Tomorrow would bring the real battle. And Delilah would soon learn that humiliating a king comes with consequences that do not fade like spilled wine. The next morning was the calmest Sunday I had known in 5 years. I woke at 5 a.m. as sunlight began to crest over the skyline. Not in the suburban mansion where I had been insulted, but in my private corporate penthouse downtown. I brewed strong black coffee and stood before the floor-to-ceiling windows, watching the city stir awake. My hands were steady. The tremors were gone. The hunched shoulders, the confused pauses finished. I was no fading patriarch. I was Alaric Vaughn, founder and majority shareholder of Vaughn Logistics. And I was reclaiming what was mine. At exactly 8 a.m., my phone vibrated on the glass table. An automated voice from the federal holding facility informed me I had a collect call from an inmate. I accepted, placed it on speaker, and took a measured sip of coffee. Dad Spencer began. His tone was loud, rushed, laced with entitlement. The tears from the night before had evaporated. Shock had faded, arrogance restored. He believed the raid was a clerical error, a bureaucratic mix-up by some incompetent auditor. "Listen carefully," he said, addressing me like an assistant. "Call our wealth manager immediately. Liquidate whatever bonds are necessary and wire bail to the courthouse. They're holding me and Delilah in filthy concrete cells. It smells like bleach and sweat. They took my shoelaces and my watch. This is outrageous. Fix it. Have the lawyers sue for harassment. I have a golf tournament next weekend. I'm not spending another minute here." I sat back and let him speak. He was demanding I empty my accounts to rescue him from federal charges after 8 months of stealing millions from my company. He had thrown wine in my face, and now he wanted the vault keys. When he paused for breath, I leaned forward. "You think this is a mistake, Spencer?" I asked. My voice was no longer fragile. It was steady, deep, cold as iron. The voice of the man who had built an empire and was prepared to defend it. Spencer went quiet for a beat, clearly thrown by the steel in my voice. "What are you talking about?" He snapped, irritation rushing back in to mask uncertainty. "Of course it's a mistake. Some idiot at the IRS flagged our vendor accounts. It's a glitch with the new tax software. Just call the bank, Dad, and stop asking ridiculous questions. I am the chief executive officer of this company, and I'm telling you to authorize the wire transfer immediately." I took another slow sip of my coffee. "You are not the chief executive officer of anything," I said calmly. The line fell into a heavy silence. Even the distant clatter of the holding facility seemed to recede. "What did you just say?" His voice dropped darker now. At 7 o'clock this morning, I replied I convened an emergency meeting of the board of directors. As founder and majority shareholder, I exercise my authority to restructure executive leadership. Your title has been revoked. Your access credentials have been terminated. 1 hour ago, you were officially dismissed for gross financial misconduct. Dad. His voice fractured. "You can't do that. You're retired. You don't even know what's happening. I know everything, Spencer. I let each word land deliberately. I know about the Delaware shell corporations. I know about the fabricated vendor invoices. I know about the offshore accounts. I know about the $2 million you diverted to purchase that vacation property for Delilah and her parents. I know you have been draining my company while humiliating me in my own home." His breathing grew uneven. The realization was finally breaking through. The old man he had mocked for 8 months was the same man who had engineered the raid. "You called the FBI," he whispered. "I didn't set you up," I corrected him. "I provided documentation for the trap you built yourself." He said nothing. As for bail, I continued, "Forget it. Every personal and corporate account linked to your name has been frozen. Your credit cards are inactive, your trust distributions are suspended, your vehicles are being repossessed. You have no liquidity, no leverage, no safety net. Dad, please." The entitlement was gone. What remained was panic. They're talking about 20 years, wire fraud, money laundering. I'm your son. You have to help me. I'll fix it. I'll pay everything back. Just call the bank. "You sat at my table and called me useless," I said evenly. "You watched your wife throw wine on the last shirt your mother ever bought me. You did nothing. You chose arrogance over loyalty. I am not calling the bank. You will sit in that cell and understand what happens when you betray the foundation that built you." I ended the call. The silence that followed was absolute. It was the hardest decision a father could make, but rot spreads, and a diseased branch must be cut before it poisons the tree. My responsibility was not to one reckless man. It was to the legacy Yvonne and I created, and to the 500 employees who depended on it. Less than 5 minutes later, my phone rang again. Kendrick, I answered. Alaric, we have a problem, he said, tension sharp in his voice. What kind of problem? It's Delilah. She's out. I straightened. Impossible. The judge set bail at $250,000. Her accounts are frozen. She didn't use cash, Kendrick said. Her parents panicked. They secured a bondsman at dawn and pledged their country club estate as collateral. The judge approved temporary release. She walked out 10 minutes ago. Where is she going? She's not heading home. Our security team tracked her phone. She's in a taxi en route to Vaughn Logistics headquarters. I reached for my suit jacket. She knows agents seized the physical documents at the mansion, Kendrick continued. She's trying to reach the downtown office before IRS auditors arrive Monday. She intends to wipe the financial servers and destroy digital archives. Desperation makes people reckless. She's planning to burn the evidence, Kendrick finished. A slow, cold smile spread across my face. Delilah believed she was clever. She thought she could outmaneuver an old man one final time. She imagined she could walk into my building, access the system, and erase months of fraud. What she didn't understand was this. I had anticipated that move the moment she lifted that wine glass. The servers had been mirrored weeks ago. Every byte of data duplicated onto encrypted cloud storage and a secure federal repository. Access credentials had been quietly restructured at sunrise. The downtown office security protocols were no longer under her control. She was not heading toward salvation. She was walking directly into the second phase of the operation. I buttoned my jacket, finished the last of my coffee, and headed for the door. The game was no longer defensive. It was strategic, and this time I was 3 moves ahead. Tell security to let her in, I instructed Kendrick. Don't stop her at the front desk. Let her ride the elevator. Let her reach the executive floor. Alaric, are you certain? He asked. If she gets into those systems, we could lose the primary ledgers. She won't access anything, I replied, fastening my jacket. Because I'll be waiting for her. I left the penthouse with my keys in hand. The real war was beginning now, and I intended to make sure Delilah regretted ever testing my patience. Vaughn Logistics headquarters rose above downtown in steel and glass, a monument to 40 years of grit. Early Sunday left the building hollow and silent. I waited in the shadows of the senior finance department while Kendrick stood near the windows overlooking the quiet skyline. We kept the lights off. The only illumination came from the pale morning glow filtering through tinted glass. Before us, rows of servers hummed inside their climate-controlled enclosure, the financial heartbeat of my empire. 40 years ago, Yvonne had balanced these ledgers by hand at a folding table. Now the woman who had stained her memory with red wine was coming here to destroy it. The executive elevator chimed. Glass doors slid open with force. High heels struck hardwood in frantic rhythm. Delilah burst into the department like an animal backed into a corner. The polished country club princess was gone. Her hair hung tangled and dull. She still wore the designer dress from Easter dinner, now wrinkled and damp from a night in federal custody. In her hand was a heavy metal hammer with a red handle likely torn from the emergency firebox in the hall. Her eyes scanned the darkened room. She rushed toward the primary server rack, raised the hammer high, fully intending to obliterate the master drives. I flipped the main switch. Fluorescent lights blazed to life. "Drop it, Delilah," I said. My voice carried through the room with sharp authority. She screamed and released the hammer. It struck the floor with a solid thud. She turned, blinking against the brightness. When she saw me seated at the head of the conference table beside Kendrick, the color drained from her face. "What are you doing here?" she stammered, retreating a step. "This is restricted. You're retired. I'm the acting vice president of operations. You need to leave." Even cornered, she clung to illusion. I rose slowly and lifted a thick manila folder from the table. "You are not vice president of anything," I said evenly. "You are a federal defendant on temporary bail secured by your parents' mortgage estate. You just entered a restricted corporate facility carrying a weapon with intent to destroy evidence. That qualifies as obstruction in an active federal investigation." Kendrick remained silent. "Security footage of your arrival has already been forwarded to the district attorney," I continued. "Your bail will be revoked before noon." Her breathing turned erratic. "You can't do this," she pleaded. "We're family. I'm your daughter-in-law. This was just a mistake." I stepped closer and placed the folder on the glass table with deliberate force. "Family does not drain the company that feeds them. I opened the folder revealing printed records. Let's discuss your brother Chad, I said, the brilliant tech entrepreneur who enjoyed mocking my clothes. Her expression froze. Bank transfers, equity shares, silent investment vehicles. Delilah's lips parted, but no sound emerged. She understood. This was never just about her, and I had been several moves ahead from the very beginning. She stared at the document spread across the glass desk, and the color drained from her face. Her fingers trembled as her eyes skimmed the highlighted figures, the routing numbers, the signatures. Yes, I said evenly, watching panic take root. I know about Chad. My forensic accountant had dismantled the illusion, piece by piece. 3 phantom consulting firms, all registered to the same rented post office box in Delaware. For 8 months, Delilah and Spencer had approved monthly payments of $50,000 to those entities' payments for software optimization services that never existed. I tapped the highlighted transfers. You used Vaughn Logistics to bankroll your brother's fake success story, I continued. Designer sneakers, a luxury apartment, press coverage, all funded by stolen corporate revenue. You didn't just commit fraud, you made your brother an accessory to federal money laundering. For a brief moment, the weight of it all seemed to settle on her shoulders. She understood what she had done, not only to herself, but to the golden child she idolized. Then the entitlement returned. She straightened her posture and glared at me with venom. You think you're clever, old man, she hissed. You think you can destroy my family because your name is etched on the building. If you hand those papers to the feds, I swear I'll drag you down with me. I tilted my head slightly. And how do you intend to do that? A brittle smile stretched across her face. I'll go to the press, major networks, business journals. I'll tell them Vaughn Logistics pays off union bosses. I'll say you cut safety corners to fatten your profits. I'll tell agents you ordered the offshore accounts. I'll bury your reputation. I looked at her and I laughed. Not a polite chuckle, a full resonant laugh that filled the room. Her smirk faltered. You think this is amusing? She snapped. I stepped closer until she had to tilt her chin upward. I built this company with my hands, I said. 40 years ago, I drove freight through blizzards while eating cold sandwiches so my drivers got paid on time. I never missed payroll, never cheated a worker, never bribed a soul. My record is clean because I did the work. I leaned in. My legacy is untouchable. If you tell fairy tales, investigators will compare them to the evidence on this table, and they'll laugh you out of the building. I turned to Kendrick. Call security. Escort her out. Her bail prohibits company property. She lunged for the folder, shrieking, but Kendrick moved it out of reach. Within minutes, security had her contained. As she was dragged toward the elevators, she screamed threats and curses, but I had already turned away. Delilah's arrest was only phase 2. That afternoon, I returned to the mansion. The doors were replaced, the glass swept clean. I poured a bourbon and sat in my reclaimed silence. Then the brass knocker pounded violently. I opened the door myself. Chad stood there, designer sneakers, tailored sweatpants, indignation blazing in his eyes. He brushed past me without invitation. You vindictive fossil, he barked. I know what you did to my sister. You sent federal agents to destroy her because you can't accept that Spencer modernized your outdated dinosaur operation. I closed the door calmly. You broke into my house to lecture me? I came with an ultimatum, he shot back, pacing across my imported rug. Drop every charge against Delilah. If you don't, I'll destroy you. I've got media contacts, podcasts, investors. I'll expose you as a predatory billionaire who weaponizes federal agencies. I'll cancel you and your trucking relic by tomorrow morning. He believed social media influence was artillery. I sat down and sipped my bourbon. Chad, I said quietly, do you know why I never invested in your startup 3 years ago? Because you don't understand innovation, he sneered. No, I corrected him, because I recognize fraud. He stiffened. You brag about being self-made, I continued, but you never secured legitimate seed capital. You never closed a real funding round. His jaw tightened. You used my money. Silence stretched. My forensic accountant traced every stolen dollar, I said. The phantom consulting firms. They routed funds directly into your startup's operating account. Your angel investor was my company. He shook his head. That's insane. No, I replied calmly. It's documented. I retrieved another file from the side table and opened it before him. Wire transfers, timestamps, digital signatures. The same $50,000 payments that funded Delilah's schemes had quietly fueled his tech fantasy. You built your brand on stolen capital, I said. Your lease, your payroll, your press campaigns, all subsidized by embezzlement. His bravado cracked. You can't prove I knew. Intent won't save you from financial forensics. The funds are traceable. The shell companies connect to your equity filings. Your board minutes reflect capital infusions that originated from corporate theft. He swallowed. You threatened to destroy me, I added. But you're standing on a platform built with my resources. He tried to rally. If you move against me, I'll countersue. I'll spin the narrative. Narratives don't survive subpoenas, I said evenly. The room felt smaller now. You have two choices, I continued. Cooperate with federal investigators, provide sworn testimony, and unwind your financial ties, or remain defiant and share a defendant's table. He stared at the evidence again. For the first time, the Silicon Valley disruptor looked young. I didn't know it was illegal, he muttered. You knew it wasn't yours. Silence returned. I finished my bourbon and stood. You and your sister mistook restraint for weakness, I said. You mistook patience for ignorance. I built this empire by anticipating storms. You thought you could outmaneuver experience. He looked toward the door. What happens now? He asked quietly. That depends on how honest you're prepared to be. I walked him to the foyer. Understand this, I added before opening the door. This was never about pride. It was about protection. My drivers, my mechanics, my employees, my wife's memory. He stepped outside, shaken. The door closed. The house was silent again. Toxic people don't disappear easily, but when you pull them out by the roots, they stop growing back. And I had just begun. Delilah didn't just embezzle money for dresses and vacations, I said evenly. She routed more than $2 million from Vaughn Logistics through phantom consulting firms in Delaware and funneled it straight into your startup. Your company wasn't built on innovation. It was built on stolen federal funds. You're not a visionary, Chad. You're a beneficiary of money laundering. That's a lie, he shouted, but the confidence in his voice fractured. You can't prove any of that. My venture capital firm just approved a $10 million Series A. I'm backed by the biggest investors in the state. I smiled a measured, deliberate smile that drained the color from his face. You were backed, I corrected him. I pulled out my phone. I didn't dial law enforcement or security. I called Marcus Vance, senior managing partner of the venture capital firm that had just committed to Chad's expansion round. Marcus and I had shared poker tables for 15 years. We served together on multiple corporate boards. He respected numbers, and he respected risk. I placed the phone on speaker between us. Marcus answered on the second ring. Alaric, my friend. Good to hear from you. Marcus, I said, never breaking eye contact with Chad. I need to alert you to a severe compliance issue involving your recent acquisition, the startup run by Chad. Chad lunged toward the phone, but I raised one finger. He stopped. What issue? Marcus asked, his tone sharpening. The seed capital used to establish Chad's company was embezzled from Vaughn Logistics, I said clearly. Funds were siphoned by my former executives and laundered into his startup through shell entities. The FBI and IRS have already executed tactical raids. Indictments for wire fraud and money laundering are in process. If your firm releases that $10 million, your portfolio will become entangled in a federal racketeering investigation. Silence settled over the line. In the background, I could hear Marcus typing rapidly. After a long pause, he spoke again, his voice stripped of warmth. Alaric, I appreciate the courtesy. We are suspending the funding immediately. The round is terminated. All backing withdrawn. A formal disavowal notice will be issued within the hour. That company is now a liability. The call ended. The click echoed louder than any shout. Chad stood frozen as if lightning had struck him. His mouth moved, but no sound emerged. Then his phone began vibrating relentlessly inside his pocket. He pulled it out with shaking hands. Notifications flooded his screen, banking alerts, board member, messages, legal advisories. The funding evaporated in real time. The valuation collapsed. Investor confidence vanished. In less than 5 minutes, his empire imploded. His phone slipped from his fingers and landed on the rug. His knees gave out beneath him. The self-styled disruptor dropped to the floor, gasping for air, eyes wide with disbelief. The bravado was gone. He looked smaller now. Get off my floor, I said calmly. He looked up at me, shattered. You tried to crown yourself with money you didn't earn, I continued. Now you can explain to federal auditors how your startup was capitalized. He swallowed hard. Leave, I added, my tone devoid of sympathy. Before I have you escorted out in handcuffs. He didn't argue. He didn't threaten. He pulled himself upright, stumbling toward the door like a man who had aged 20 years in a single afternoon. Without another word, he disappeared into the fading daylight. The house fell silent again. I lifted my glass of bourbon and took a slow sip. The perimeter was secure, but the true unraveling was happening elsewhere in a concrete holding facility where desperation was replacing arrogance. Delilah had just lost everything her parents' estate pledged as collateral, her access to stolen funds, and now the brother she risked prison to enrich had been financially erased. A cornered rat always turns on the nearest target, and the nearest target to Delilah was Spencer. They were confined together, now two architects of their own collapse staring at the walls closing in. Without money, without leverage, without illusion, the cracks in their marriage would widen fast. There is a difference between someone who makes a mistake and someone who is fundamentally corrupt. A mistake can be corrected. Corruption consumes everything around it. And in that holding cell, the consequences were just beginning. When a decent person is caught doing something wrong, shame is the first emotion that surfaces. They apologize. They try to repair the damage. They look for a way to make things right. But when someone is fundamentally corrupt and backed into a corner, remorse never appears. Survival does. Survival at any cost. And that cost is usually paid by whoever stands closest. Delilah was not ashamed. I had dismantled her safety net piece by piece. Her aristocratic parents were financially exposed. Her brother's fraudulent tech empire had collapsed in a single afternoon. The illusion of superiority she had wrapped herself in for years was burning down around her. She was technically free-released on a temporary bail bond secured by her parents' mortgage estate. But freedom without leverage is an illusion. She knew the federal prosecutors were building their case. She knew money laundering and corporate fraud carried decades of prison time. She had nothing left, so she chose the only path selfish people ever choose when consequences arrive. She decided to run. I was reviewing the morning financial summaries in my office when Kendrick stepped in without knocking. He didn't sit. He stood in the doorway wearing a dark, satisfied smile. "Our security team tracked her," he said. She just entered the downtown flagship branch of First Sterling Continental. First Sterling was not an ordinary bank. It was the kind of institution that required at least $5 million in liquid assets just to open an account. Delilah had maintained a VIP profile there for 8 months, funded entirely by stolen corporate money. She went straight to private wealth management, Kendrick continued, skipped the teller lines. I could picture it clearly. Dark designer sunglasses, silk trench coat, moving like she still owned the world. She demanded entry into the private lounge on the second floor, sat down in a leather chair across from the senior branch manager, slapped her heavy black corporate card onto the mahogany desk, ordered an immediate wire transfer of $250,000 to an offshore account in the Cayman Islands. Then she requested a one-way first-class ticket to Dubai that afternoon. Dubai, no simple extradition pathway. She intended to disappear. What she didn't know was that I had anticipated exactly that move. 2 days earlier, Kendrick had delivered federal injunction documents directly to First Sterling's executive board. The bank understood that any account connected to Vaughn Logistics was now under active federal scrutiny. I had given very specific instructions on how to handle her if she ever returned. The branch manager picked up the black card and typed the account number into her terminal. The screen flashed red, full freeze. Transaction denied. Delilah's composure cracked instantly. She slammed her palms on the desk and demanded an explanation, raised her voice, asked the manager if she understood who she was dealing with, threatened to close her accounts, threatened careers. The manager did not blink. Instead, she calmly opened her desk drawer and removed a pair of heavy steel shears. Right there in the quiet luxury lounge, she cut the exclusive black card in half. The metallic snap echoed. She placed the severed pieces on the desk and informed Delilah that the account had been seized by the FBI and IRS. All financial instruments tied to the frozen assets were legally confiscated. Then she delivered the final blow. Attempting to initiate a transfer from a federally frozen account while on bail constituted an additional felony violation. Authorities had been notified. She pressed the silent alarm beneath her desk. The blood drained from Delilah's face. In that moment, she was no longer a wealthy client commanding deference. She was a defendant who had just handed prosecutors another charge. Through the glass walls of the lounge, she heard sirens approaching. Panic detonated. She grabbed her designer bag, knocked over the leather chair, and bolted toward the stairwell. High heels clattered down concrete steps. She burst through a service exit and vanished into the downtown crowd minutes before police cruisers sealed the main entrance. She was officially a fugitive. Violating bail conditions meant federal marshals would prioritize her capture before sunset. But a cornered predator doesn't just run. It searches for a shield. An hour later, Kendrick returned carrying a small digital audio recorder. "Spencer received a call 20 minutes ago," he said. "All inmate communications in federal holding are recorded." Kendrick's connections within the district attorney's office had secured a copy. He placed the device on my desk and pressed play. Delilah's voice flooded the room, hysterical, breathless, raw. She had called from a burner phone in an alleyway, not to comfort her husband, not to plan strategy. She called to sacrifice him. Through the recording, I heard her sobbing and shouting. She told Spencer the marshals were coming, that her parents would lose their home, that everything was collapsing. Then came the demand. She ordered him to confess to everything. She instructed him to contact prosecutors and claim sole responsibility for the embezzlement, to state that he masterminded the shell corporations, that he coerced her into signing vendor contracts, that she had no knowledge of stolen funds. She wanted him to burn alone. There was no partnership, no loyalty, no marriage, only self-preservation. The recording captured Spencer's silence, then his disbelief. "You want me to take all of it?" he asked weakly. "You're the CEO," she snapped. "You can survive this. I can't." The line crackled with desperation. She promised to wait for him, promised to stand by him if he saved her first. Even in collapse, she manipulated. I sat back in my chair as the recording ended. There it was. The difference between error and corruption. A mistake admits fault. Corruption calculates survival. And Delilah had just made her final calculation. She was demanding that my son volunteer for a 20-year federal sentence so she could walk away untouched. I listened carefully to Spencer's voice in the recording. It was no longer arrogant. It was fractured, hollow. He asked her how she could even suggest such a thing. He reminded her they were supposed to be partners. He reminded her he had burned every bridge with his own father to finance the lifestyle she insisted on. Her response was ice. The sobbing stopped mid-breath. The vulnerability vanished. What replaced it was something venomous and precise. "If you actually love me," she told him coldly, "you'll take the fall." She called him weak, useless. She said accepting the blame was the only meaningful contribution he had ever made to her life. She warned him that if he did not confess before the end of the day, she would file for divorce immediately and testify against him personally. She promised to make sure he rotted in federal prison while she rebuilt her life with a real man. The line disconnected with a sharp click. Silence filled my office as the recording ended. Kendrick powered down the device without a word. My son had humiliated me at my own table to impress a woman who was now prepared to sacrifice him without hesitation. For the first time in his life, Spencer was staring directly at the truth. He had no money, no power, no father, and now he understood he had no wife. The psychological collapse was complete. But I knew what came next. When pride disintegrates, desperation follows. And desperate men do not fall quietly. They drag whoever they can into the abyss. The real bloodbath was just beginning. I stood inside the observation room at the federal building, the lights dimmed behind me. A thick pane of one-way glass separated me from the sterile interrogation chamber on the other side. The room was cold clinical, a metal table bolted to the floor, 2 steel chairs, no comfort, no illusion of status. Spencer sat alone in one of those chairs. He still wore the same tailored suit from Easter dinner, but it no longer fit the image he once carried. The fabric was wrinkled and stained, the cuffs marked with sweat. He looked exhausted, yet somewhere behind his eyes lingered a stubborn trace of denial. He still believed someone would rescue him, that expensive attorneys would appear, that Delilah would walk through the door, that this nightmare was temporary. He had no idea it was about to reach its peak. Detective Miller stood beside me in the darkness, arms folded. "The marshals picked up Delilah 3 hours ago," he said quietly. "She didn't make it to Dubai. They intercepted her at a private airstrip trying to charter a jet. She had a bag full of stolen jewelry. I did not look away from the glass, and the moment they cuffed her, he continued. She didn't ask for her parents. She didn't ask for her defense attorney. She asked for the prosecutor. I wasn't surprised. When the ship sinks," I replied calmly, "rats climb over each other." Miller tapped the glass lightly. "Watch this," he said. "This is going to break him." 2 federal agents entered the interrogation room, carrying a silver laptop and a thick stack of transcripts. They did not sit. They did not offer water. They did not engage in small talk. They placed the laptop in front of Spencer and turned the screen toward him. He lifted his head slowly. "I'm not saying anything," he muttered, irritation masking anxiety. "Not until my wife gets here. We have joint counsel. You're wasting your time." The lead agent said nothing. He pressed play. Delilah's voice filled the concrete chamber. But it wasn't the mocking tone from Easter dinner. It wasn't the commanding voice that had ordered him to confess. It was trembling, fragile, helpless. I didn't know she cried through the speakers. Spencer controlled everything. He handled the money. He kept me in the dark. He would shove legal contracts in front of me and demand I sign them. Her performance was flawless. When I asked about the consulting firms, he'd get furious. He threatened to cut me off. He said I'd be left with nothing if I didn't cooperate. I was scared of him. I watched the transformation happen in real time. The blood drained from Spencer's face. His jaw slackened. His eyes widened as if something poisonous had materialized before him. The recording continued. He hated his father. She sobbed. He told me Alaric was ruining the company. He said the old man deserved to lose everything. I begged him to stop taking money. I begged him not to touch the accounts. Lie after lie delivered with theatrical vulnerability. He forced me to sit on the boards of those shell companies. He used my name to cover his tracks. I'm a victim. He's the mastermind. The agent paused the recording. Silence. It was the kind of silence that crushes the chest. Spencer gripped the edge of the metal table so tightly his knuckles blanched white. His breathing became shallow and erratic. He looked like a drowning man searching for oxygen. The woman he worshipped had just positioned him as a tyrant, an abuser, the architect of everything. She had handed him to federal prosecutors like a gift. I saw it register in his memory. Easter dinner, his fist on the table, her laughter, the wine splashing across my chest, the shirt Yvonne had bought me. He thought they were aligned. He thought humiliation was loyalty. Now he understood. He had been disposable from the beginning. The lead agent leaned forward slightly. "Mr. Vaughn," he said evenly, "your wife has requested immunity in exchange for full cooperation." The word struck like a hammer. Immunity. Spencer's shoulders sagged. He looked toward the door as if expecting her to burst in and deny everything. She didn't. She has provided documentation. The agent continued sliding the transcripts forward. Emails, text messages, financial authorizations. Spencer stared at the pages but did not read them. In the observation room, I felt something shift. Not anger, not satisfaction, finality. The illusion of partnership had shattered completely. Spencer blinked rapidly, trying to steady himself. "She wouldn't," he whispered, but she had, and he knew it. The man who had once believed he was untouchable now understood he had been used, manipulated, positioned as collateral. His empire was gone. His marriage was fiction. His arrogance had no shield left. The agent waited. "Do you want to amend your statement?" he asked calmly. Spencer swallowed hard. The war between loyalty and survival was unfolding inside him. And for the first time in his life, he had no one left to blame. Through the glass, I watched him break. Not loudly, not dramatically, but internally. The kind of fracture that cannot be repaired. He remembered everything. The way he dismissed me, the way he laughed, the way he chose her approval over legacy. And now he understood the cost. The team he thought he belonged to had never existed. He had been standing alone the entire time. He had mistaken her cruelty toward me for loyalty to him. But cruelty is never loyalty. Cruelty is a loaded weapon, and the moment Delilah ran out of other targets, she turned the barrel directly toward his head. Spencer's body finally gave in. He lowered his forehead onto the cold metal table and broke. This was not the frustrated anger of a man caught in a scheme. It was not the rage of a businessman exposed. It was something deeper, uglier, and far more final. It was the guttural, shattered sobbing of a man who had just watched his entire illusion collapse. His shoulders shook violently inside his ruin-tailored suit. The fabric that once symbolized power now clung to him like a costume stripped of meaning. Each breath tore out of him, as if his lungs were collapsing under the weight of betrayal. He had nothing left. He had burned the bridge to his father in order to build a castle with his wife. Now that wife had locked him in the dungeon and set the castle ablaze. The federal agent stood motionless, arms folded, allowing the silence to stretch. They were trained for this moment. They knew that true confessions were not pulled from anger, they were extracted from collapse. They let the betrayal finish what the evidence had started. Eventually, Spencer lifted his head. His face was a ruin of tears and sweat, but something inside his eyes had changed. The sorrow hardened, crystallizing into something raw and combustible. If he was falling, he would drag her down with him. "She's lying," he rasped, voice shredded from crying. "She's a manipulative sociopath. She created the shell companies to funnel money to her brother. She forged the invoices. I can prove it. I can prove all of it." The lead agent calmly withdrew a notepad. "We're listening," he replied coolly. "But you'll need to give us something substantial if you expect reconsideration of her immunity." Spencer wiped his face with trembling hands. Then he looked directly at the one-way mirror. He couldn't see me standing in the darkness beyond it. But he knew. "Dad," he said hoarsely, leaning toward the glass. "If you're back there, listen to me." The desperation in his voice echoed through the speakers in the observation room. "I know you want to destroy her. I know she ruined everything. But the federal accountants don't have the full picture. Delilah has a hidden offshore slush fund, commercial real estate in the Caribbean under a different maiden name, millions that haven't been found. He swallowed hard. Let me talk to you. I'll give you the account numbers, every detail. I'll hand you the final pieces. Just come in here and talk to me. In the darkness beside me, Detective Miller shifted slightly. Well, Alaric, he asked quietly, you want to hear him out? I adjusted the cuffs of my suit jacket and studied the broken figure on the other side of the glass. The rage was gone. The tears were slowing. All that remained was clarity. Open the door, I said softly. It's time for a final board meeting with my former chief executive officer. The steel door groaned open. The air inside the interrogation room smelled of disinfectant and regret. The agents stepped out, leaving us alone. The door shut behind them with a heavy metallic thud that echoed in the sterile space. Spencer looked smaller up close. His wrist was shackled to a ring bolted into the floor. The chains clinked when he shifted. The man who had pounded his fist on my mahogany dining table just 2 nights earlier was nowhere to be seen. In his place sat a trembling, exhausted boy. His once impeccable suit was wrinkled and stained. His hair was disheveled. His eyes were red and swollen from hours of crying. When I pulled the chair back and sat across from him, he immediately began weeping again. Daddy choked. You came. I knew you wouldn't leave me here. The chains rattled as he leaned forward desperately. You have to believe me, I was manipulated. Delilah isolated me. She made me feel inadequate, like I was always second to you. She convinced me the only way to survive, to modernize the company, was to move money. She told me it was strategy. She told me it was protection. He swallowed hard. She poisoned my mind. She orchestrated everything. I was trying to hold my marriage together. She brainwashed me. He lifted his shackled hands slightly. She's the monster. I'm just her victim. I did not move. I did not reach across the table. I did not offer him a father's comfort. I let his excuses linger in the stale air. You think this is about her? I asked quietly. My voice held no anger, only steel. You think I'm sitting in this federal building because of the lies your wife told you? His breathing hitched. The offshore accounts, he rushed. I can give you everything. The account numbers, the property deeds, the real estate in the Caribbean. If I cooperate, you can talk to the prosecutor. You can negotiate. We can destroy her together. We can fix this. I leaned forward, resting my forearms on the cold table. I searched his bloodshot eyes. I searched for accountability, for responsibility, for the honorable man his mother believed he could become. I found none. You have always been a coward, Spencer, I said calmly. The words landed like a blade. You've always chosen the easier path. When something required strength, you outsourced it. When conflict appeared, you hid. When consequences came, you looked for someone else to carry them. He flinched visibly. Dad, please. I'm not finished. Silence fell again. You sit here blaming Delilah for your crimes, but she didn't force your signature onto fraudulent contracts. She didn't hold your hand when you fired drivers who had worked for me for decades. She didn't make you siphon pensions to fund vacations. His breathing grew uneven. And she did not force you to sit at my table and call me useless. The shame hit him visibly. His face twisted as if he might be sick. That wine she threw at me, I continued. It didn't hurt. It ruined a shirt your mother bought for me, yes. But that wasn't the wound. I leaned closer. The wound was watching my son sit silently while it happened. His shoulders collapsed inward. You looked away, I said. Because defending me would have cost you something. Dad, I'm sorry, he whispered. The words sounded hollow. I studied him carefully. I built that company with your mother, I said. We ate cold sandwiches in truck cabs so payroll wouldn't bounce. We never missed a check. We never stole from our people. He sobbed quietly. And you, I continued, risked 500 families for vanity. He buried his face in his hands again. I'll confess, he said through tears. I'll cooperate. Just help me. There it was. Not remorse. Fear. Help you, I repeated evenly. He nodded desperately. I can reduce your exposure, he pressed. If you help me negotiate. I leaned back slightly. You're still negotiating, I said softly. You still think this is a transaction. The truth finally settled between us. I'm not here to save you, I continued. I'm here to tell you something before I walk out. He looked up slowly. You are not a victim of your wife, I said. You are a victim of your own weakness. The room felt smaller. You chose arrogance over humility, image over integrity, approval over legacy. His tears slowed. You betrayed your own foundation. Silence. You want mercy? I asked quietly. He nodded faintly. Mercy would have been standing up at that dinner table. The words lingered. You will cooperate with the federal agents, I said, calmly. Not for me, not for revenge, but because it's the first honest thing you'll have done in months. His breathing steadied slightly. As for your sentence, I added, you will face what you earned. He looked shattered. And I said, rising from the chair will protect what remains. The chains clinked as he shifted. Dad, he whispered again. But there was nothing left to say. I walked to the steel door and knocked once. It opened immediately. As I stepped out into the corridor, I did not look back. The board meeting was over, and for the first time in 40 years, I understood something with perfect clarity. An empire can survive fraud. It can survive scandal, but it cannot survive cowardice at its core. I am so sorry. The apology fell from Spencer's mouth like something already broken beyond repair. I rose slowly from the steel chair. Its legs scraped harshly across the concrete floor, the metallic shriek ricocheting off the walls of the interrogation room. The sound lingered raw and unforgiving. You offered me offshore account numbers to purchase my mercy, I said, looking down at his trembling shoulders. His expensive suit hung loosely now, wrinkled and stained from the holding cell. The federal agents are standing just outside that door with a pen and a legal pad. You are going to give them every routing number, every shell company, every hidden transfer connected to Delilah's stolen millions. He nodded frantically, tears streaking down his face. Cooperating with the government, I continued evenly, is the only leverage you have left in this world. I paused deliberately. But do not ever mistake your cooperation for my forgiveness. His breath caught. I turned my back and began walking toward the heavy steel door. Dad, wait! Spencer screamed, jerking violently against the chain secured to his wrist. The metal clanged sharply against the bolted table. Where are you going? You can't just leave me here. You have to help me get out. I stopped but did not immediately face him. I let the silence press down on his panic. Then I turned and looked at him one final time. I memorized the image, the swollen eyes, the broken posture, the desperation replacing arrogance. I wanted the truth burned into memory so sentiment would never rewrite it later. I did not come here to save you, Spencer, I said quietly, each word landing with chilling finality. I came here to watch you pay the price. I knocked twice. The agents opened the door instantly. I stepped into the corridor without looking back. His sobs echoed faintly as the steel door sealed shut behind me. The rot had been removed. The courthouse hallway was long and sterile, fluorescent lights humming softly overhead. My footsteps were measured and steady as I walked toward the exit. For the first time in months, I felt something resembling balance, not revenge, order. The infection had been cut out. Outside, warm afternoon sunlight flooded the courthouse steps. Kendrick leaned casually against my black SUV secure phone, pressed to his ear. When he saw me, he ended the call and slipped the device into his jacket pocket. A sharp, calculating smile curved across his face. How did the board meeting go? He asked, extending a thick manila folder toward me. He's cooperating fully, I replied, taking the folder and sliding into the back seat. He'll hand over every offshore account Delilah tried to conceal. He believes it will save him. It won't. Even with cooperation, he's looking at a decade behind bars. Kendrick climbed in beside me. What do you have? I asked. He chuckled darkly. Delilah's parents are unraveling, he said. Richard and Susan put their country club estate up as collateral for her bail. After her attempted escape on that private jet, the judge revoked bail permanently. The bondsman is seizing their property. Bankrupt? I asked calmly. Completely, and desperate. I opened the folder resting on my lap. Inside were printed screenshots from a luxury real estate listing. My house. They're trying to sell it, I said, staring at glossy photographs of my living room and custom kitchen, the same room where wine had been thrown in my face. Exactly, Kendrick replied, eyes gleaming. They contacted a luxury broker early this morning. They are trying to liquidate the mansion quickly to pay off the bail bondsman and secure high-end defense counsel for their daughter. I flipped through the listing details. Richard is telling brokers the property belongs to Spencer Kendrick, continued, claiming he has family authority to sell. I closed the folder with a deliberate snap. They don't understand trusts, I murmured. They think they're walking away with millions in clean cash, Kendrick said. They're hosting an open house and estate liquidation tomorrow afternoon. I leaned back against the leather seat, feeling the familiar chill of strategy settle in my bloodstream. Tell the driver to proceed, I said. It's time Richard received a real estate education. The sun hung bright over the upscale neighborhood as our vehicle turned onto the familiar street. Luxury cars lined the curb. Red signs were planted across my manicured lawn, exclusive estate sale, open house. Richard and Susan were hosting a fire sale. They had lost their own mansion. Now they believed mine was their salvation. They were inside pricing furniture, accepting offers, liquidating property they had no legal claim to. I stepped out of the SUV and buttoned my bespoke jacket. Kendrick followed, briefcase in hand. We walked up the driveway past wealthy bargain hunters carrying crystal lamps and imported rugs. I felt anger simmer in my chest, but my face remained composed, controlled. The front doors were wide open. Inside, the scene was grotesque. Susan stood near the staircase, clipboard in hand, bargaining over a vintage chandelier. Richard strutted across the living room, holding a glass of sparkling water, boasting about ceiling height and hardwood finishes, as though he had built the house himself. I walked directly behind him. The broker and potential buyers noticed my posture first. Conversation faltered. Richard turned slowly, irritation visible. The smile vanished from his face. "What are you doing here, Alaric?" he hissed. "This is a private estate sale. You have no right to be here. Leave before I call security." I regarded him with calm, almost clinical pity. "You are selling my house, Richard," I said evenly. He laughed, puffing out his chest. "This is not your house," he sneered. "It belongs to my son-in-law and my daughter. And since they are currently fighting ridiculous false charges, you fabricated I have family authority to liquidate their assets. We've already accepted a $4 million cash offer." He stepped closer, confident. "You're powerless here." I did not argue. Instead, I turned to the real estate broker. "Are you the listing agent?" I asked. "Yes, sir," the broker replied nervously. "Mr. Richard signed the exclusive agreement this morning." I glanced back at Richard. He was smiling, smugly convinced he had legally secured a fortune. "Kendrick," I said softly, "please clarify the situation." My attorney stepped forward, placing his briefcase on a marble table and opening it with a precise metallic click. He withdrew certified documents stamped with the county seal. "Mr. Richard Kendrick began, voice cold, and measured you, stated before multiple witnesses that this property belongs to Spencer and Delilah, that you possess authority to sell." Richard folded his arms, attempting composure, though sweat glistened at his temple. "I'm afraid," Kendrick continued, lifting the deed for all to see, "you have made a catastrophic legal error." Silence filled the room. "This estate," Kendrick said, "clearly was purchased in cash 7 years ago by Alaric Vaughn. Immediately upon acquisition, it was transferred into the Yvonne Vaughn Irrevocable Living Trust." Susan's clipboard slipped from her hands, clattering to the floor. "Mr. Vaughn," Kendrick continued, "is the sole trustee and legal owner. Spencer was merely a conditional tenant. His name appears nowhere on the deed. Delilah has zero claim." The broker's face drained of color. "You signed a brokerage agreement claiming ownership rights you do not possess," Kendrick added. "That constitutes attempted wire fraud and real estate fraud." The crowd began to shift uneasily. By attempting to execute a $4 million transaction across banking lines without legal title, Kendrick continued calmly, "You have exposed yourself to federal charges." The broker snatched the deed, scanning it with horror. "You lied to me," he whispered to Richard. "It is a federal felony," Kendrick clarified. People began setting furniture down. The room emptied quickly. The broker tore up his marketing materials. "I'm voiding this contract," he snapped, storming out. Richard stood frozen, the illusion collapsing around him. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. Susan fell to her knees, pleading. "You laughed when wine was thrown in my face," I reminded her. "You believed silence meant weakness." They left in humiliation, walking down the driveway past former friends who now avoided eye contact. The open house was over. The illusion was gone. An order had been restored. "What are you talking about?" Richard demanded, his voice cracking, despite his attempt to sound authoritative. Kendrick did not flinch. He lifted the first certified document and held it where the real estate broker could see it clearly. "This property," Kendrick announced, his tone projecting across the entire living room, "was never purchased by Spencer Vaughn." A ripple of confusion moved through the room. "It was acquired in cash 7 years ago by Alaric Vaughn." He continued, enunciating each word carefully, and immediately transferred into the Yvonne Vaughn Irrevocable Living Trust. Susan's clipboard slipped from her fingers and struck the marble floor with a sharp, hollow crack. "The sole trustee and legal owner of this estate," Kendrick said, raising the deed slightly higher, "is Mr. Alaric Vaughn, who is standing right here." He turned slightly so that everyone present could see me. "Spencer Vaughn was listed only as a conditional tenant. His name does not appear on the deed. Delilah Vaughn has no ownership interest, and you, Mr. Richard, have just attempted to sell a multi-million-dollar property that does not belong to you." The real estate broker's face drained of color. He snatched the document from Kendrick's hand, scanning the embossed seal and notarized signatures. His eyes widened with unmistakable horror. He turned toward Richard as if he were looking at a man infected with something contagious. "You signed a binding brokerage agreement claiming authority to sell this house?" The broker shouted, panic tightening his voice. "You represented yourself as having legal control. You lied to me. You just dragged my firm into a federal crime. It's called wire fraud and real estate fraud." Kendrick added calmly as if he were explaining a textbook definition. Attempting to execute a fraudulent sale across state banking lines for a $4 million payout constitutes a Class B federal felony. The room went silent. We have already notified the district attorney's office, Kendrick continued. Local authorities are en route to process the contracts you signed and collect formal statements. The destruction was immediate. The wealthy neighbors who had been admiring chandeliers and antique sideboards suddenly set them down as though they had turned radioactive. The murmur of conversation dissolved into whispers of fear. Within seconds, the open house transformed into something else entirely, a potential crime scene. Guests rushed toward the front doors, desperate to distance themselves from what now smelled like scandal. Shoes scraped hurriedly across the hardwood floors. Expensive handbags were clutched tightly. The illusion of exclusivity evaporated. The broker threw his glossy brochures onto the floor. "I am voiding this contract immediately," he barked, pointing a trembling finger at Richard. "You are a fraud. My legal team will be in contact." He stormed out without another word. Richard stood frozen in the center of the living room, chest rising and falling rapidly. The aristocratic confidence that had defined him minutes earlier had vanished. His carefully constructed world had shattered in front of witnesses. He had no estate, no authority, no leverage. His daughter was in federal custody. His own mansion was already being seized. And now he was facing potential felony charges. "Get out of my house," I said quietly. My voice carried no anger, only finality. Susan collapsed to her knees on the imported rug, tears streaking her carefully applied makeup. "Alaric, please," she sobbed. "We have nowhere to go. We have no car, no accounts left. You can't throw us onto the street." I looked at her without warmth. "You sat at my dining table," I reminded her, "and laughed when your daughter threw wine in my face." She lowered her head. "You mistook my silence for weakness. You believed you could erase me. You believed you could take my legacy." I stepped closer. "You have 2 minutes to leave this property before my private security escorts you out." Richard did not argue. The fight was gone. They stood slowly, dignity in ruins, and walked toward the door empty-handed. Outside, former friends pretended not to see them. Their humiliation was complete. When the doors closed behind them, the house fell silent. I stood alone in the living room, feeling order return. But I knew something else remained. Delilah had lived under this roof for 3 years. People like her never leave without burying something. I turned to Kendrick, called the demolition crew. Monday morning, the house echoed with the sound of destruction. I stood in the hallway outside the master suite as workers began dismantling it piece by piece. I had instructed the foreman to strip everything down to the studs. The walk-in closets, the imported French hardwood floors, the custom cabinetry. Nothing was to remain. The crash of sledgehammers against drywall reverberated through the ceilings. Crowbars pried up expensive planks. Dust floated in shafts of sunlight like ash from a funeral pyre. The noise did not bother me. It was cleansing. It sounded like surgery, like infected tissue being removed from a once healthy body. Later that morning, as I sat in the kitchen drinking black coffee, the foreman approached me. He wiped drywall dust from his forehead, hesitation written across his face. "Sir," he said slowly, "we found something." He did not elaborate. He didn't need to. I followed him upstairs. The master suite was unrecognizable, stripped raw, exposed. Splintered boards and torn insulation littered the floor. The foreman led me to the far corner of Delilah's walk-in closet. Several oak floorboards had been removed, revealing a dark cavity between the floor joists. Inside that hollow space sat a heavy reinforced steel biometric safe. It rested there quietly, hidden beneath imported hardwood beneath my own roof. I looked down at it and smiled. Spencer had never mentioned this. If he had known, he would have offered it to federal agents immediately to bargain for mercy. This was Delilah's secret. Toxic people never fully trust anyone, not even the weak spouse they manipulate. They build escape routes. They construct hidden lifeboats. They siphon and stash and plan for collapse. She had been diverting money quietly, storing it beneath the very floor she walked on. I pulled out my phone and called my security chief. "Bring an industrial drill and an angle grinder," I instructed. "We're opening it now." Preserving the lock was irrelevant. 20 minutes later, the hallway filled with sparks as the grinder bit into reinforced steel. The noise was deafening, metallic shrieks bouncing off exposed beams. Finally, with a heavy snap, the internal hinges gave way. The safe door creaked open. Inside were sealed envelopes of bearer bonds, stacks of foreign currency jewelry pieces wrapped in velvet cloth, and a leather folder containing property deeds under a maiden alias. At the bottom lay several encrypted external hard drives, Delilah's contingency plan, her private war chest, Her silent exit strategy. I stared at the contents without surprise. Kendrick, I said calmly, notify the federal task force. They'll want to inventory this. Within the hour, agents were photographing and cataloging every item. The last secret had surfaced. As the safe was removed and the floor cavity left empty, I stood in the gutted master suite. Sunlight poured through bare framing where drywall once stood. The room no longer smelled of perfume or cologne, only fresh wood and dust. The house was clean again, not just legally, physically, spiritually. And for the first time since that Easter dinner, I felt something deeper than satisfaction. I felt finality. Sparks scattered across the dust-filled closet as the grinder finally cut through the reinforced steel. The sound was violent, metallic final. When the heavy door was pried open and fell back on its hinges, the full scale of Delilah's greed revealed itself without shame. The safe was packed to capacity. Neat, dense stacks of $100 bills filled the interior wall to wall, each bundle cinched tight with thick rubber bands. It was not pocket change. It was not emergency savings. It was easily several $100,000 in untraceable cash. Beside the money sat sleek black velvet jewelry cases, arranged carefully as if curated for display. I opened them one by one. Diamond necklaces heavy enough to anchor a conscience. Platinum tennis bracelets thick with brilliance. Solid gold watches, expensive liquid, easily transferable assets. These were not heirlooms passed down through generations. They were not sentimental gifts. They were portable wealth purchased deliberately with stolen corporate funds. It was textbook laundering strategy. Convert traceable money into tangible luxury. Store it quietly, sell it fast, smuggle it if necessary. She had prepared an exit plan with clinical precision. She just never expected the old man she mocked to rip up the floorboards. A lesser man might have quietly pocketed the cash. A lesser man might have justified reclaiming losses inflicted on his company. But I am not a lesser man. I did not build Vaughn Logistics by hiding money in shadows or cutting dark corners. I built it in daylight through sweat discipline and transparent work. I took out my phone and dialed the direct line of the lead IRS investigator assigned to the case. My demolition crew just uncovered a significant cache of concealed assets, I told him evenly. Cash, jewelry, hard drives. There was silence on the other end, then controlled urgency. Within 30 minutes, 2 black government vehicles rolled into my driveway. Federal agents stepped out carrying evidence bags and digital cameras. They moved through my home with professional precision, climbing the staircase into the gutted master suite. I stood in the doorway while they cataloged every stack of cash and every piece of jewelry. The lead agent shook his head slowly. This changes everything, he said. Delilah was already facing decades for wire fraud and corporate embezzlement, but concealing hundreds of thousands of dollars in a biometric floor safe elevated the charges significantly. Felony concealment of assets, tax evasion, obstruction of an active federal investigation. This was not just greed, this was intent. They sealed the money in evidence bags and carried her hidden escape fund out the front door. She had buried her future beneath my floors. Now it sat in a federal evidence locker. News travels quickly among desperate people. Her high-priced defense attorney received notification. That same afternoon, the concealed assets had been seized and added to the indictment. When Delilah heard, she unraveled. She was no longer in a luxury home. She was sitting in a cheap roadside motel, bankrupt, isolated, cornered. Her parents were homeless. Her brother's startup was dead. Her husband was in federal custody, actively cooperating. And now her final lifeline, her emergency cash, her diamonds, her gold was gone. She could not pay her lawyers. She could not flee. She could not negotiate from strength. She was backed into a concrete corner. But toxic entitlement rarely surrenders quietly. When narcissists lose money power, and allies they reach for the cheapest weapon available, public sympathy. Delilah understood she could not win in a federal courtroom. The financial trail was airtight. The evidence was physical and undeniable. So she pivoted. If she could not win legally, she would attempt to win emotionally. She picked up her smartphone and opened her social media accounts. In the dim light of that motel room, she staged herself carefully. She mussed her blonde hair. She smeared mascara under her eyes. She positioned the camera to capture vulnerability, not guilt. Then she pressed record. She began constructing the most manipulative narrative of her life. She would not be a criminal. She would be a victim. She was preparing to tell the internet she was an innocent white woman being financially hunted and emotionally abused by her powerful, vindictive black father-in-law. She was about to ignite a digital firestorm, hoping outrage would burn me instead of her. She intended to weaponize perception. I have lived 73 years. I have seen war and business betrayal in family and desperation in men who thought they were untouchable. But there is a specific poison that circulates through modern society. It is the weaponization of victimhood. When facts collapse, some people pivot to narrative. When evidence suffocates, they reach for emotion. When guilt is undeniable, they seek sympathy. Delilah realized the safe was gone. Her legal avenues were exhausted. Her leverage had evaporated, so she chose performance. What she did not understand, what she never understood, is that I built my empire not only on freight routes and contracts, but on preparation. She thought she could create a storm. She had no idea I controlled the forecast. She had exhausted every resource in the physical world, money seized accounts, frozen allies bankrupt. So she did what desperate people do when reality collapses. She fled to the digital arena. From a dim, low-budget motel room, she propped her smartphone on a stack of paperback books and pressed record. I watched the finished product hours later, from my downtown office, the video glowing across my laptop screen. I will give her this, she was a remarkable performer. She wore a plain gray sweater carefully chosen to suggest humility. Her blonde hair was slightly disheveled, but not chaotic, artfully undone. Her mascara was smeared just enough to imply sleepless nights and emotional trauma. She stared directly into the camera lens as if confiding in a trusted friend. Then she began. She told a story of survival. She claimed that she and my son Spencer were victims crushed beneath the heel of a tyrannical billionaire. She described me as an aggressive, oppressive black patriarch who weaponized wealth to destroy anyone who challenged him. She wept, insisting the corporate transfers were nothing more than accounting misunderstandings, exaggerated by a vindictive father-in-law. At one point, she went further. She suggested I targeted her because she was a white woman from a respectable family. She implied that I resented her background, that I sought to dismantle her so-called aristocratic identity out of bitterness. It was calculated. It was strategic. And it worked. Within hours, the video detonated across social media platforms. Outrage spread faster than facts ever could. Millions watched her tear-streaked performance and reacted instinctively. Anger requires no verification. My corporate headquarters was flooded with hostile calls. Anonymous accounts began flooding the Vaughn Logistics website with boycotts and accusations. Comment sections filled with strangers calling for federal investigations into my business. Local news anchors ran evening segments framing the situation as a ruthless mogul sending his own son to prison over a family disagreement. The narrative was simple, emotional, digestible. Kendrick stormed into my office phone, clutched tightly in his hand. He paced the carpet like a man tracking a financial hurricane. We need a statement, he insisted. Immediately, a formal press release. We publish the financial documents. We control the narrative before Monday. If this continues, the stock could take a hit. I remained seated in my leather chair and took a slow sip of black coffee. Kendrick, I said calmly, put your phone down. He hesitated. Arguing with the internet, I continued, is like punching the ocean. You exhaust yourself. The water remains. When a toxic person constructs a public lie, you do not scramble beneath it. You let them climb to the top of their fragile pedestal. Then you remove the pillar. Oh, I asked him a simple question. Do you remember when I upgraded the mansion security system 3 years ago? He blinked. I had installed high-definition cameras throughout the common areas, complete with crystal-clear audio. One of them overlooked the formal dining room. I opened a secure folder on my laptop and selected a video file. Watch, I said. The raw Easter Sunday footage filled the screen. There was Spencer at the head of the table, posturing like a king. The audio was pristine, the echo of crystal glasses, the scrape of cutlery. Then his voice sharp, angry, calling me useless. Delilah's laugh followed, cold, precise. The camera captured her lifting the wine glass, the deliberate motion, the arc of dark red liquid as it struck my face, the linen shirt Yvonne's gift absorbing the stain, the room's silence, my slow removal of glasses, the quiet wipe of my face, my exit, and behind me, their smirks. Kendrick did not speak. His jaw tightened as he watched every second. There were no edits, no spin, no commentary, just truth. Kendrick asked me what I intended to do with the footage. I had no interest in uploading it to some obscure social media account, where it could be buried beneath trending gossip or dissected by her remaining sympathizers. I did not want debate. I wanted clarity. I wanted saturation. I wanted the truth delivered in a way that could not be ignored, muted, or spun. Kendrick, I said, evenly call the agency. Within minutes, our corporate advertising firm was on a secure conference line. I authorized a $1 million cash expenditure to be deployed within 4 hours. No drawn-out strategy meetings. No slow drip campaign, immediate impact. We purchased every available premium commercial slot during the evening news across all major local networks. We secured targeted digital ad placements on every major social media platform, focusing precisely on the demographic segments that had amplified Delilah's victim narrative. The algorithm had fed them her tears. Now it would feed them the truth. I refused dramatic music, no somber piano, no emotional narration, no carefully worded defense. There would be no voiceover from me explaining context, no legal disclaimers cluttering the screen, only raw footage. At exactly 7 p.m., the broadcast aired. Across living rooms, on smartphones, on tablets during commercial breaks and between scrolling sessions, screens shifted to the elegant dining room of my suburban estate. The footage was pristine. Spencer at the head of the table, posture rigid with arrogance, his voice sharp and venomous, accusing his own father of irrelevance. Delilah's laughter cold, precise, cutting through the room like glass. The deliberate lift of her crystal wine glass. The arc of dark red liquid. The impact. The silence that followed. The blue linen shirt Yvonne's gift absorbing the stain. My quiet removal of my glasses. The wipe. The exit. No edits, no commentary. At the end of the clip, a single line of white text appeared against a black background. This is the real Delilah Vaughn. This is how she treats the man she stole millions from. Do not let a thief cry victim. The reaction was immediate. The internet's rage did not dissipate, it reversed direction with violent force. The same digital mob that had rallied behind her performance now felt betrayed. Outrage thrives on narrative, but nothing enrages the public more than realizing they have been manipulated. Her comment sections transformed within minutes. Sympathy evaporated. In its place came disgust. Users labeled the footage what it was: elder abuse, assault, entitlement, cruelty. News stations that had questioned my ethics pivoted without hesitation. The footage ran in loops during late-night segments. Headlines shifted tone. I was no longer the oppressive billionaire. I was the father humiliated in his own home. Delilah's phone numbers leaked. Her social media accounts were flooded with tens of thousands of hostile messages. Former country club acquaintances rushed to issue public statements distancing themselves from her. A boutique public relations firm that had quietly considered representing her released a formal statement, clarifying they would never align with individuals associated with elder abuse. She became untouchable, radioactive. She could not appear in public without being recognized as the woman who threw wine at a 73-year-old man. She had attempted to bury my reputation. Instead, she had televised her own moral collapse. And while she scrambled in digital ashes, federal prosecutors continued building their case. The stage was nearly complete, but destruction rarely stops with one person. Desperation breeds stupidity. When arrogant people lose access to easy money, they do not suddenly embrace discipline or humility. They seek shortcuts. They look for theft dressed as opportunity. Chad was the embodiment of that impulse. Just days earlier, he had styled himself as a visionary, an innovator in designer sneakers, pitching a hollow logistics startup to venture capitalists. He had mocked Vaughn Logistics at my own table, calling it obsolete. He said freight hauling was a dying industry, that his software would eliminate companies like mine. One phone call to his lead investor dissolved that fantasy in under 5 minutes. The funding vanished. His accounts, fueled largely by Delilah's embezzled money, were frozen by federal order. His landlord evicted him from his luxury loft. The leased sports car was repossessed. The visionary was suddenly a man without bus fare. Chad realized something painful. Digital dreams collapse quickly. Steel and diesel endure. He decided that if he could not build a fortune, he would steal one. During the height of the embezzlement scheme, Delilah had given him a master vendor access card. She framed it as harmless, allowing him to inspect our secondary freight yard for potential software integrations. He kept the card. He thought it was a skeleton key. On a rain-soaked Tuesday night, Chad boarded a city bus to the industrial South Side. He wore dark clothing hood, pulled tight, trying to resemble a seasoned criminal, instead of a frightened tech entrepreneur improvising a felony. I know precisely what he wore. I was watching him. From my downtown penthouse office, high-definition security feeds displayed the freight yard in crystal clarity. Vaughn Logistics does not operate on outdated systems. Our facilities are layered with biometric access points, infrared perimeter sensors, and AI-driven anomaly detection. The moment Chad swiped that deactivated vendor card, the perimeter system flagged the breach. An alert appeared on my encrypted tablet. He believed he had slipped inside unnoticed. He had not. The cameras followed him as he crossed the wet asphalt rain, glistening under industrial floodlights. He bypassed older rigs and headed straight for one of our newest Peterbilt units attached to a fully loaded trailer of high-value consumer electronics. Truck and cargo combined over $500,000. Chad had located a black market chop operation willing to purchase a stolen rig for a substantial cash payout. He had convinced himself that one bold act would restore his status. He climbed into the cab. Each of my trucks is a rolling fortress equipped with biometric ignition, night vision cabin cameras, and military-grade GPS trackers. Chad did not know that the ignition override port he accessed triggers a silent secondary authentication protocol. He plugged in his illegal bypass device. The diesel engine roared. The cabin camera illuminated his face in green-tinted light. He grinned wide, triumphant, foolish. In his mind, he had beaten the dinosaur. I did not call the police. Not yet. I watched him guide the truck toward the yard's exit gate. The system allowed the gate to open. Chad thought fortune favored him. What he failed to understand was that sometimes the door opens not because you succeeded, but because you are being led exactly where you need to go. I did not activate the blaring alarm system at the freight yard. There was no need. I wanted Chad to leave the property undisturbed. I wanted him to feel the intoxicating surge of triumph that only a successful theft can provide. But more importantly, I wanted him on the highway. Stealing a commercial truck within city limits is a serious felony. But transporting a stolen commercial vehicle loaded with corporate cargo across a state line transforms the crime into a federal offense under the Interstate Commerce Act. That distinction invites federal marshals, escalates sentencing guidelines, and guarantees a mandatory minimum term inside a federal penitentiary. I was not interested in a local charge. I wanted weight. I wanted permanence. From the comfort of my leather armchair in my penthouse office, I tracked the blinking red dot on my encrypted map interface. Chad merged onto the interstate rain, slicking the asphalt beneath him. He accelerated confidently, pushing $500,000 worth of steel and electronics toward the border. Inside the cabin, he turned up the radio. I watched through the interior camera as he bobbed his head to the music, grinning at his reflection in the windshield. He believed he had just outsmarted me. For 2 full hours, I let him drive. I let him put distance between himself and the city. I wanted isolation. I wanted the illusion of escape to root itself deeply in his mind. When the red dot approached the state line, I picked up my phone and contacted the Federal Highway Patrol. I identified myself calmly. I provided the exact GPS coordinates, vehicle description, speed, and route trajectory. I instructed them to position units precisely 1 mile beyond the border marker. The live feed remained steady. The truck rumbled past the large reflective green sign, welcoming drivers into the neighboring state. The moment the trailer's rear axles crossed the painted line, the crime became federal. The trap was complete. I tapped a single red icon on my tablet. Inside the cab, the remote satellite kill switch engaged instantly. The diesel engine cut without warning. Fuel lines sealed. Dashboard lights blinked and went black. The onboard safety system deployed smoothly, guiding the 18-wheeler toward the gravel shoulder in a controlled stop. From the interior camera, I saw Chad's face transform. The music died. The steering wheel stiffened. He twisted the ignition repeatedly, panic rising in visible waves. Nothing. He struck the wheel with his palm, shouting in disbelief. His eyes darted around the cabin. As the reality settled over him, he was stranded on a dark federal interstate, inside a stolen commercial vehicle. Then came the lights. Red and blue strobes erupted in the side mirrors, flooding the cab in violent flashes. Federal Highway Patrol cruisers boxed in the truck from every angle. Tactical vehicles sealed the shoulder. A bullhorn cracked through the rain. Driver, throw the keys out the window and exit the vehicle with your hands visible. Chad began to cry. The same pathetic collapse his sister had displayed when the steel cuffs met her wrists. He opened the door and descended the metal steps unsteadily. His knees hit wet asphalt. Hands trembled skyward. Officers swarmed forward, forcing him flat against the ground and securing his wrists behind his back with deliberate efficiency. I watched the entire operation from my penthouse suite. Flawless. Chad had styled himself as a disruptor, a visionary. In truth, he was merely another arrogant thief stepping directly into a digital cage I had constructed long before he imagined the theft. Now the illusion of that family's superiority was ash. The sister faced decades for embezzlement and concealment of assets. The parents were bankrupt, publicly disgraced, and awaiting their own legal consequences. The brother was a federal inmate charged with grand theft and interstate trafficking. They had laughed at the old man at the head of the table. They had mistaken restraint for weakness. I dismantled them without raising my voice. There is a difference between loyalty and convenience. When relationships are built on stolen money and social vanity, the first fracture causes total collapse. Days later, I sat quietly in a sterile conference room inside the federal courthouse. As the primary victim of their corporate fraud, I was permitted to observe. The room smelled of burnt coffee and institutional fatigue. A heavy mahogany table was buried beneath legal files, forensic accounting reports, photographs of the biometric floor safe recovered from my home. On one side sat Spencer. He looked hollowed out. Pale skin, dark circles beneath his eyes. His once tailored suits replaced by prison-issue fabric. At the opposite end sat Delilah. Distance separated them like a physical wound. She wore a plain gray jumpsuit that erased any trace of former glamour. The country club princess was gone. In her place sat a cornered animal. At the head of the table stood the senior federal prosecutor, a man who had spent 2 decades dismantling corrupt executives. He did not care about pedigree. He cared about evidence. He reviewed it clinically. Every stolen dollar traced, fraudulent vendor invoices, Delaware shell corporations, Caribbean offshore accounts, the hundreds of thousands in cash and diamonds hidden beneath my floorboards. He explained the charges: multiple counts of wire fraud, tax evasion, money laundering, obstruction of a federal investigation. If they proceeded to trial, he assured them he would seek mandatory minimum sentences of 25 years each. Silence settled heavily. Spencer stared at his hands. Delilah gripped the table's edge until her knuckles whitened. Then the prosecutor slid 2 identical documents forward: a global plea agreement, full admission of guilt, immediate surrender of all remaining concealed assets. In exchange, the federal government would cap their sentences at 8 years. They would be free before turning 50. But there was a condition. It was a package deal. Both signatures today or the offer vanished permanently. If one refused, both faced the full weight of prosecution. The air shifted. Tension sharpened. You cannot confine 2 starving predators in a cage with a single lifeline and expect harmony. Delilah broke first. She slammed her palm against the table and declared she would not sign. She refused to sacrifice 8 years for what she labeled her husband's incompetence. Her finger stabbed toward Spencer as she accused him of being the architect. She insisted he accept the 25-year sentence so she could walk free. Spencer's head snapped upward. The sorrow drained from his face, replaced by something darker: rage. He had sacrificed relationships' integrity, even his father's respect, to maintain her lifestyle. He had protected her until she turned on him in the interrogation room. Now she demanded his complete destruction. He leaned forward and shouted back. He called her a parasite. He accused her of orchestrating the scheme. He described her obsession with outperforming country club peers. He told the room no purchase was ever sufficient to satisfy her greed. The prosecutor did not interrupt. He allowed them to tear each other apart. Convenience masquerading as loyalty had finally unraveled. And as I sat in that quiet corner, I understood something simple. The empire had not collapsed because I attacked it. It collapsed because its foundation was built on theft, ego, and betrayal. All I did was remove the illusion. He shouted that she had been the one who recruited the offshore accountants with reputations as murky as the accounts they managed. He insisted she orchestrated the sham consulting contracts that siphoned stolen corporate funds straight into the pockets of her beloved tech bro brother Chad. The court-appointed defense attorneys jolted forward in alarm, whispering frantically, urging their clients to lower their voices and stop volunteering new confessions into the official federal record. But restraint was gone. The dam had fractured beyond repair. Years of ego resentment manipulation and mutual deception erupted in that sterile conference room. The floodgates of their toxic marriage swung open, unleashing a relentless torrent of bitter truth. Neither of them had the discipline or the intelligence to stop it. Delilah let out a sharp, hysterical laugh that echoed off the cold walls. She mocked Spencer openly in front of the federal prosecutor and the marshals standing silently behind him. She announced that her husband was so incompetent, he used to lock himself in his home office and cry because he had no idea how to run the logistics empire his father built from nothing. She claimed she seized control of the company's finances because Spencer was too foolish to manage vendor contracts. With deliberate cruelty, she stripped away whatever pride he had left. She told him she never loved him. She married him, she admitted, because she believed he would inherit a billion-dollar empire from what she assumed was a declining old man nearing the end of his usefulness. Spencer's face darkened into a furious crimson. Whatever shred of composure remained dissolved instantly. He leaned forward trembling and began exposing every secret Delilah had ever confided in him. He told the prosecutor about the fraudulent charity gala she organized 2 years earlier. He described how she collected more than $50,000 from wealthy neighbors under the guise of supporting a children's hospital, only to quietly pocket the entire sum for a limited edition designer handbag and an indulgent spa retreat. He provided the precise bank account where she concealed the stolen funds. Delilah shrieked in panic as he revealed her deception. She retaliated immediately. She exposed Spencer's gambling addiction. She detailed private poker nights in luxury downtown hotels, where he used stolen corporate money to settle mounting debts to underground bookmakers. She provided names, locations, and dates with reckless abandon. They tore into one another like starving animals fighting over a final scrap of survival. Each accusation furnished the prosecutor with fresh ammunition. Blinded by rage, they forgot they were seated in a federal building, surrounded by officers documenting every word. The prosecutor remained motionless at the head of the table, observing. He did not intervene. He allowed them to dismantle themselves completely. When their shouting finally gave way to breathless silence and they glared at each other with naked hatred, he calmly reached forward and retrieved the 2 plea agreements. He slid them back into his briefcase. The metallic snap of the clasp reverberated through the room like the final lock on a prison door. He informed them the global plea offer was permanently withdrawn. Their inability to cooperate and their voluntary confession to additional federal crimes left no room for leniency. He would pursue maximum consecutive sentences at trial. The room fell into suffocating quiet. Delilah stared at the empty space where her 8-year lifeline had rested. A small broken sound escaped her as she buried her face in trembling hands. Spencer sat motionless, hollow, and drained, staring at the wall as if he could already feel concrete closing in around him. I rose silently from my seat in the back corner. I adjusted my bespoke jacket and walked toward the door without speaking. Words were unnecessary. They had constructed their own prisons. Outside, the courthouse hallway was bright and warm. The collapse of their alliance was complete. All that remained was the judge's final strike. The days before sentencing were reflective and controlled. I focused on stabilizing Vaughn logistics. The board stood firmly behind me. Employees welcomed the founder's steady presence back in the executive chair. Order returned to the business. Yet the remnants of my son's artificial aristocracy continued twitching in the rubble. One rainy Thursday afternoon, my security chief knocked on my office door. He informed me that 2 individuals were downstairs without appointments, practically begging to see me. Richard and Susan. I instructed him to allow them upstairs. When the heavy glass doors opened and they stepped into my executive suite, the transformation was undeniable. Gone were tailored suits and glittering jewels. Richard wore a faded sweater that sagged on his diminished frame. His face was unshaven, eyes hollow. Susan's once polished blonde highlights had surrendered to gray roots. Her posture bent under visible strain. They had arrived by bus. They stood awkwardly on the plush carpet, too intimidated to sit. I remained seated behind my mahogany desk, hands folded, waiting. Richard spoke, first voice stripped of arrogance. Sentencing was Monday. The prosecutor intended to seek the maximum penalty after the plea collapsed. Then Susan's composure shattered. She fell to her knees. Her sobbing was raw and unfiltered. She begged for mercy. She pleaded for a victim impact statement requesting leniency. She described her daughter as fragile as someone who would not survive prison. She invoked family, forgiveness, shared wounds. I listened without interruption. When she finished, I asked her to stand. Crawling would not erase indictments. I reminded them of Easter dinner, the long custom dining table, the expensive red wine purchased with my money, the subtle smirks, the dismissive glances, the way they regarded me as if I were fortunate to share their company in my own home. I described the moment Delilah lifted the crystal glass, the red arc staining the blue linen shirt Yvonne had given me. I asked what they did in response. Nothing. No protest, no apology, only silent approval. You asked for mercy, I said softly. You believe background shields consequence. You think privilege overrides justice. Richard attempted to speak. I raised my hand, stopping him. You watched her steal millions. You benefited from it. You never questioned the source because you believed you deserved it. I stepped around the desk and stood before them. The arrogance you carried will not protect her. The justice system does not care about your former country club memberships. It does not care about zip codes. I held their gaze steadily. On Monday, she will stand before a judge and face the harvest of her actions. Susan released a broken cry. Richard lowered his head. Justice requires no performance. It waits. Now they looked like strangers, wearing the ruins of their former lives. Richard stood before me in a cheap faded sweater that sagged loosely on his diminished frame. The fabric hung awkwardly from shoulders that once carried tailored jackets worth more than most people's monthly rent. His face was unshaven gray stubble shadowing his jaw, and his eyes once sharp with superiority were hollow and ringed with exhaustion. Susan looked worse. The glossy blonde highlights she once maintained with obsessive precision were fading thick streaks of gray pushing through at the roots. Her posture, formerly stiff with practiced elegance, had collapsed inward. She seemed smaller, almost folded into herself, as though the weight of reality had physically bent her spine. Their luxury cars were gone, the estate seized, the staff dismissed. They had taken a city bus to reach my downtown building, two people who once laughed at public transportation, now gripping a metal pole among strangers. They stood awkwardly on the plush carpet of my executive office, too intimidated to sit on the leather sofa. I did not offer them coffee. I did not extend even the smallest courtesy. I remained seated behind my massive mahogany desk, hands folded, calmly waiting. Richard cleared his throat, the sound thin and uncertain. He kept his gaze lowered, unable to meet my eyes. When he finally spoke, his voice was stripped of every ounce of its former arrogance. It trembled as he explained that the sentencing hearing for Delilah and Spencer was scheduled for Monday morning. He told me the federal prosecutor intended to pursue the maximum possible penalty. The plea agreement had collapsed entirely during the interrogation room debacle. There would be no leniency. Then Susan began to cry. This was not the calculated camera-ready sobbing her daughter performed online. This was raw, unfiltered grief. Her face crumpled, and she stepped forward before suddenly dropping to her knees in front of my desk. Her trembling hands pressed against the polished wood. She begged. She pleaded with me to contact the federal judge. She asked me to submit a formal victim impact statement, requesting mercy extreme leniency. She insisted that Delilah was fundamentally a good person who had simply made catastrophic mistakes. She claimed her daughter was fragile, that a young white woman from a respectable suburban background would not survive a decade inside a maximum security federal prison. The audacity did not escape me. She looked directly into my eyes and said, it implying that her daughter's upbringing and complexion somehow rendered her too delicate for consequences. She invoked family. She spoke of forgiveness. She said healing required compassion. I did not move. I listened to every word without interruption. Richard, now openly weeping, wiped at his face with shaking fingers and nodded along as his wife continued pleading. The two of them, people who once measured human value by zip code and accent, were humiliating themselves in front of the elderly black man they had quietly dismissed for years. When Susan's sobbing finally subsided into exhausted silence, I leaned forward slightly. The stillness in my office felt heavy, almost suffocating. Susan, I said evenly, stand up. She hesitated before slowly rising, leaning heavily against Richard for support. Her knees shook. Crawling on my floor, I continued, will not rewrite the past. It will not erase the federal crimes your daughter committed. They said nothing. I let the truth settle into the room. Then I reminded them of Easter dinner. I described the long custom dining table. The imported red wine poured generously on my dime. The laughter, the glances, the subtle smirks disguised as civility. I looked directly into Richard's hollow eyes and told him I remembered exactly how he looked at me that night. The quiet condescension, the barely concealed superiority, the small cutting remarks about my background, my speech, my simplicity. They sat in my home eating food my labor paid for and regarded me as if I were temporary help. They believed themselves to be the pinnacle of refinement, while I was merely a fortunate truck driver who had stumbled into wealth. Then I turned to Susan. I described in careful detail the moment her daughter lifted that heavy crystal wine glass, the arc of dark red liquid slicing across the table, the stain spreading across the pale blue linen shirt Yvonne had given me, a shirt chosen with care by a woman who was no longer here. And I asked them a simple question. What did you do? The answer, of course, was nothing. They did not gasp. They did not reprimand her. They did not offer me a napkin. Richard chuckled. Susan rolled her eyes. They sat there in silence, endorsing the humiliation of an elderly man in his own home. You come into my office asking for mercy, I said, my voice lowering into something cold and deliberate. You ask me to save your daughter because you believe she is too good for prison. I stepped out from behind my desk. You believe her background, her education, her country club pedigree should shield her from consequences. You think the laws that govern ordinary, hard-working people do not apply to your family. Richard opened his mouth, ready to object. I raised my hand. He stopped. You watched her steal millions from the company I built with my bare hands, I said. My voice steady and controlled. You watched offshore accounts open. You enjoyed vacations funded by stolen money. You never questioned the sudden wealth because deep down, you believed you were entitled to it. I walked slowly around the desk and stopped only a few feet from them. They had no choice but to look into my eyes. The destruction you are facing now, I continued, is not cruelty. It is consequence. Their former superiority, polished and practiced for decades, was gone. In its place stood two frightened people, confronted by the collapse of everything they once assumed was permanent. You thought I was useless, I said quietly. You thought your daughter was untouchable. I let the silence stretch. She is neither. The truth did not need embellishment. It only needed to be spoken. The supreme arrogance you carried your entire lives is not going to save your daughter. Today, I said, enunciating each word slowly, deliberately, ensuring they would remember the cadence long after they left my office. The federal justice system does not care about your former country club memberships. It does not care about your upscale zip code, your private schools, or your faded designer wardrobes. The law does not bend for pedigree. It does not discriminate by skin color, and neither do I. Your daughter is a thief. She is a fraud. She is a manipulator who believed consequences were reserved for other people. On Monday morning, she will stand before a federal judge, and she will harvest exactly what she spent the last year planting. Susan released a broken, anguished cry and covered her face with trembling hands. The sound echoed sharply against the glass and steel of my office. Richard wrapped his arms around her, his shoulders shaking, not with outrage, but with total defeat. In that moment, they understood. The old man they once mocked was not going to rescue them. The invisible safety net they assumed would always exist had vanished. There was no cushion beneath them now, only hard, unforgiving ground. I extended my hand toward the heavy glass doors. Our meeting is over, I said evenly. Leave my building. Do not contact me. Do not contact my legal team ever again. They did not argue. They did not plead further. They turned and shuffled toward the exit, reduced to hollow outlines of the grand figures they once believed themselves to be. As they stepped into the elevator, they looked exactly like what they had always been beneath the polished, empty vessels sustained by illusion. I returned to my desk and sat down, slowly gazing out at the city skyline, stretching beneath the afternoon light. A deep, unfamiliar peace settled over me. The final threads tying me to their toxic dynasty had been severed. All that remained was judgment. The federal courthouse stood like a monument to consequence, white marble, polished oak, and towering columns designed to remind every visitor of their insignificance before the law. On that cold Monday morning, as I climbed the wide stone steps, I did not feel small. I felt steady. Not triumphant steady. Like a man who had crossed the finish line of a long, grueling marathon. Kendrick walked beside me, briefcase in hand. I wore a classic black tailored suit. In my breast pocket, a pale blue pocket square rested over my heart, chosen deliberately in honor of Yvonne. She believed in justice. Today justice would answer. We entered the courtroom and took our seats in the front row behind the prosecutor's table. The gallery was crowded with reporters, former associates, and curious onlookers who had followed the scandal from evening news segments to viral footage. A side door opened. The defendants were escorted in. It was a procession stripped of pride. Chad entered first. The self-proclaimed tech visionary wore an oversized khaki prison uniform. His shoulders sagged, and his eyes remained fixed on the floor. Spencer followed. My son looked older than his years. His face was pale and gaunt hair unkempt, steps dragging as though each movement required effort. Then Delilah appeared. Gone were designer labels and curated elegance. She wore a bright orange standard-issue jumpsuit. Heavy steel restraints bound her wrists and ankles, chains clinking sharply in the hushed courtroom. The sound echoed like punctuation. She looked frightened. In the back row, Richard and Susan sat silently clutching one another, weeping into folded hands. The bailiff announced the judge's entrance. Everyone stood. The judge was an older man, with a reputation carved from decades of uncompromising rulings. He settled behind the elevated mahogany bench and peered over thick reading glasses at the three defendants. He did not appear angry. He appeared disappointed. The sentencing began. The prosecutor rose and methodically summarized the mountain of evidence: fraudulent vendor accounts, offshore shell corporations, laundering through a fabricated logistics startup, and the biometric floor safe hidden beneath the master bedroom floorboards. He noted their refusal to cooperate until mutual spite drove them to betray one another. He emphasized the calculated nature of the scheme. When he finished, the judge leaned forward and folded his hands. The courtroom fell silent. Even the hum of the air conditioning felt intrusive. In 25 years on this bench, the judge began, voice measured and steady. I have presided over countless cases involving corporate greed and financial misconduct. People steal, For many reasons: fear, desperation, addiction. He paused. But this case is different. His gaze shifted between Delilah and Spencer. This case reflects not desperation, but arrogance. Not necessity, but entitlement. And perhaps, most disturbing, a complete absence of basic human decency. He lifted a file from the bench and opened it. I have personally reviewed the unedited security footage from Easter dinner. The words seemed to settle heavily in the room. He described the footage with clinical precision. He spoke of a dining table purchased with stolen funds. He spoke of laughter, of a glass raised, of red wine striking the face of a 73-year-old man seated in his own home. His tone sharpened slightly. Throwing a glass of wine into the face of an elderly man is not a domestic disagreement. It is an act of deliberate humiliation. It reveals character. He turned his gaze fully to Delilah. It demonstrates contempt, and contempt when paired with financial crime becomes dangerous. The courtroom remained utterly still. Justice was no longer abstract. It was speaking. The judge did not dilute his language, nor did he attempt to soften the blow. He stated plainly that the Easter incident constituted a calculated act of severe elder abuse, not an emotional misunderstanding, not a heated family disagreement, a deliberate humiliation of a 73-year-old man in his own home. He said the footage exposed something deeply troubling, an entrenched sickness of character. He described it as a moral vacancy. According to the court, her behavior revealed a complete absence of remorse, an utter disregard for human dignity, and a chilling lack of redeeming qualities. The staged social media performance that followed the manufactured tears, the false accusations, the manipulative racial framing were not mitigating factors. They were aggravating ones. He declared that her attempt to distort public perception and weaponize sympathy against the very victim she had wronged significantly influenced his final sentencing decision. Delilah began sobbing openly, her head shaking in desperate denial. Her trembling lips formed silent pleas for mercy. But the judge had finished listening. He turned first to Chad. He addressed him as a young man who had confused arrogance with intelligence. Stealing federally regulated commercial property and laundering embezzled funds to fabricate the illusion of a groundbreaking technology empire was not entrepreneurship. It was calculated criminal deception. The judge emphasized that commerce operates on trust. Chad had betrayed that trust to inflate his ego. The sentence was immediate: 5 consecutive years in a federal penitentiary, without the possibility of early parole. Chad's body seemed to deflate. He collapsed into his chair, sobbing uncontrollably, while a bailiff stood firmly behind him. 5 years erased because he believed he was more clever than consequence, because he thought an old truck driver would never outmaneuver him. Then the judge shifted his attention to Spencer. My son rose slowly, his knees visibly unsteady. For one fleeting second, he looked back at me over his shoulder. His eyes were filled with something raw and unguarded sorrow, regret so deep it hollowed him out from within. In that instant, he understood the magnitude of what he had destroyed. He had chosen manipulation over loyalty, vanity over integrity. But realization does not reverse time. The judge reminded Spencer that, as chief executive officer of Vaughn Logistics, he carried a fiduciary responsibility to protect employees, shareholders, and legacy. Instead, he drained his own foundation to satisfy greed. He described Spencer's actions as cowardice disguised as devotion. The sentence: 8 years in federal prison. 8 years confined within concrete walls. 8 years stripped of illusion and status. Spencer closed his eyes and bowed his head, surrendering to the weight of his decisions. Finally, the judge turned his full attention toward Delilah. She was shaking violently now, the steel restraints around her wrists clinking sharply against the wooden defense table. The judge did not temper his tone. He described her as the architect behind both emotional devastation and financial sabotage. He cited her attempt to flee the country, the hidden stash of diamonds and cash, the biometric safe concealed beneath the floorboards, and her malicious campaign to assassinate my public reputation. He referred to her as a parasitic threat to the social order. Then, in a voice that resonated through marble columns and polished oak like distant thunder, he delivered the final reckoning. 12 consecutive years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. Delilah screamed. Her knees buckled beneath her and she collapsed toward the courtroom floor. 2 federal bailiffs caught her under the arms and forced her upright. She cried out for her mother. She cried out for her attorney. She shouted that the sentence was unjust. But justice had already spoken. The illusion of privilege evaporated in that moment. She was no longer a curated socialite surrounded by curated wealth. She was federal inmate number 4729. The judge lifted the heavy wooden gavel and struck it down with decisive force. The sharp crack reverberated across the courtroom, bringing the hearing to an absolute and final end. To me, that sound was not harsh. It was beautiful. It was the sound of closure. The bailiffs immediately seized the three defendants and escorted them toward the side exit that led to federal transport buses. Spencer did not look back again. Chad was sobbing too violently to walk in a straight line. Delilah was hysterical, dragging her feet and resisting, as officers maneuvered her into the dim holding corridor. I remained seated for several long seconds, listening to the heavy door click shut behind them. The infection that had poisoned my life had finally been excised. I rose slowly and buttoned my black suit jacket. Kendrick placed a steady, respectful hand on my shoulder. Without a word, we walked down the center aisle of the courtroom. Reporters and spectators instinctively parted to either side, clearing a path. Outside sunlight flooded the courthouse steps. The air felt clean. My empire remained intact, my dignity unbroken, the legacy of Yvonne and Alaric Vaughn secure. The courthouse had been constructed from marble and oak, but the true war had never been fought there. It had been fought inside my home. Instead of returning to my downtown penthouse, I instructed my driver to take me directly to the suburban estate. Federal agents had completed their final sweep days earlier, yet the structure still carried the residue of contamination. I unlocked the heavy front doors and stepped into the grand foyer. The silence was no longer hostile, but what remained visually was intolerable. For 3 years, Delilah had systematically stripped the soul from this house using stolen corporate money. Yvonne had designed this estate as a sanctuary, rich earth tones, deep mahogany woodwork, layered textures that invited warmth and conversation. Delilah erased it. She painted the walls a sterile shade of clinical white. She smothered the original hardwood floors beneath cold gray rugs that resembled corporate waiting rooms. She removed Yvonne's landscape oil paintings and replaced them with oversized metallic abstract pieces devoid of meaning. Every room felt like a showroom dedicated to ego. I walked into the formal dining room. The mahogany table remained a monument to permanence, but it was surrounded by transparent acrylic chairs, costing $3,000 each, designed more for aesthetic display than comfort. I stood at the exact spot where red wine had struck my face. For a moment I could hear her laughter echoing off the stark white walls. That was enough. I decided I would not spend a single night in this house until every trace of her existence was removed. Early the next morning, I hired an elite demolition and restoration crew. I paid triple their standard rate. I wanted urgency. By 8 o'clock, 4 massive industrial steel dumpsters lined my circular driveway. Coffee in hand, I stood in the center of the foyer, pointing methodically at each object that offended my eyes. I instructed the foreman to begin in the living room. 4 workers lifted the pale gray velvet sectional, custom-made and utterly soulless, and carried it out through the front doors. They tossed it without ceremony into the steel dumpster. I directed them next to the oversized crystal chandelier she had installed in the entryway. It was an ostentatious structure of cold glass and harsh light. They dismantled it piece by piece and discarded it. Abstract metallic art panels were ripped from the walls. Gray rugs were torn up, revealing the beautiful hardwood beneath. The cleansing had begun, and I did not intend to stop until my home breathed again. It stood like a grotesque shrine to ego, an oversized chandelier of jagged crystal that poured a cold, merciless glare across the foyer. The light it produced never comforted the room. It bleached it. I remained still, hands folded behind my back, as the crew climbed their ladders and began dismantling it shard by shard. Each piece descended with a faint metallic chime before being carried outside and thrown into the steel dumpster. There was no sentiment attached to it, no hesitation, only removal. I moved methodically through the corridors, issuing instructions in a calm, even tone. Every abstract metallic panel that had replaced Yvonne's gentle landscapes was stripped from the walls. Sheets of chrome and steel art that reflected nothing but vanity were stacked like scrap and hauled away. The lifeless gray rugs were torn up and rolled aside, revealing beneath them the rich honey-toned hardwood floors that had once absorbed birthday laughter and quiet winter evenings. The second-floor master suite demanded something deeper than renovation. It required purification. The demolition crew had already ripped open the closet floor to retrieve the biometric safe, but that was merely the beginning. "Continue," I told the foreman. The master bathroom had been transformed into a mausoleum of white marble, gleaming surfaces so sterile they felt surgical. "Take it all out," I ordered. Sledgehammers rose and fell in deliberate arcs. Marble fractured under each blow. Tile splintered. Fixtures collapsed in a chorus of breaking stone. The thunder of demolition rolled through the mansion like distant artillery fire. The noise did not unsettle me. It grounded me. The sharp crack of marble and the shatter of acrylic felt like toxins being scraped from bone. This was not destruction for its own sake. It was cleansing. By late afternoon, the dumpsters lining the driveway overflowed with what had once been purchased at obscene cost furniture fixtures, and decor that had drained both money and spirit from these rooms. When the final truck carried the debris away, the air seemed lighter. The erasure was complete. Now restoration could begin. I summoned painters, carpenters, and craftsmen who understood the difference between expense and elegance. I handed the lead designer a thick album filled with photographs from a decade earlier, images taken when Yvonne still walked through these rooms like living sunlight. I want it precisely as it was, I said. For 5 days, the mansion vibrated with purposeful life. The stark white walls were layered over with warm, grounding hues, muted amber deep, taupe subtle olive. Baseboards were sanded and polished until the mahogany gleamed with depth and warmth. Harsh corners softened. Rooms exhaled. Meanwhile, I directed my security team to retrieve a large climate-controlled storage unit from our downtown warehouse. Inside were the pieces Delilah had banished Yvonne's oil paintings, heirloom furniture-framed family photographs once lining the stairwell. I supervised as each artifact returned to its rightful place. We rehung Yvonne's favorite landscape above the fireplace, a quiet field under an amber sky. Her woven rugs were unrolled across the polished floors. The oversized leather sofas, worn and softened by years of living, were set back in the living room. The sterile showroom aesthetic vanished. The Vaughn sanctuary lived again. By Saturday afternoon, the crew packed their tools and drove away down the long driveway. The house smelled of fresh paint and lemon wood polish, but beneath it lingered something subtler, the faint echo of Yvonne's presence. I locked the front doors and stood alone in the foyer. The silence was extraordinary. Not heavy, not tense, whole. There were no hushed arguments about offshore accounts, no brittle laughter ricocheting off cold walls, only the gentle hum of the air system and golden light filtering through tall windows. I walked into the living room. It felt warm. I opened the antique liquor cabinet and removed a heavy crystal decanter filled with aged bourbon. I poured a generous measure into a thick glass. Ice settled with a soft, satisfying clink. I lowered myself into my favorite leather armchair beside the stone fireplace. The worn leather embraced me like an old ally. I took a slow sip. The bourbon burned warmly down my throat and spread across my chest. My gaze drifted. Richard once stood near the mantel boasting about hollow ventures. He was gone. The dining room doorway remained still. No wine thrown, no cruel laughter. Spencer now sat behind concrete walls stripped of illusion. The weeds had been uprooted. The soil was protected. I leaned back and closed my eyes. The conflict had ended. I had defended my legacy. I had shielded my company. I had honored Yvonne's name. The man they dismissed as obsolete had endured and prevailed. For the first time in 5 years, I was alone in my own home. And it was right. Yet peace did not mean complacency. Monday morning, I rose at 5 precisely. I dressed in a Navy suit and drove myself downtown to the glass headquarters of Vaughn Logistics. For 8 months, I had permitted them to believe I was fading, an aging founder, drifting while my son and his wife siphoned strength from the enterprise. That illusion dissolved at sunrise. When I entered the lobby, the shift was immediate. The security guard straightened with quiet respect. The receptionist smiled with visible relief. Employees who had feared for their pensions under Spencer's leadership looked at me as if a storm had finally broken. I stepped into the executive boardroom. Vice presidents and regional managers waited in taut silence. I took my seat at the head of the mahogany table. I did not recount scandal. The vacation is over, I said evenly. We returned to work. For 3 months, we repaired the damage with deliberate precision. Offshore assets were recovered. Vendor contracts stabilized. Drivers and mechanics unjustly dismissed received personal calls and reinstatements. I walked the freight yards again, inhaling diesel and asphalt. I shook hands with men loading trailers and told them plainly we were steady again. And we were. Operations strengthened. Confidence returned, but numbers alone do not define legacy. The trail clarifies it. I understood that wealth without discernment becomes a liability. I had given Spencer comfort without demanding character. That mistake would not repeat. I committed $5 million of my own capital to establish the Yvonne Vaughn Memorial Scholarship Fund. Its mission was direct full academic scholarships and business grants for hardworking Black students from the neighborhoods where Yvonne and I once struggled. I sought grit, hunger, discipline. The first scholarship went to a young woman pursuing mechanical engineering. When I handed her the check, her parents' eyes filled with genuine tears, unrehearsed, unmanufactured. The contrast was unmistakable. When I signed the final documents, I glanced at Yvonne's photograph on my desk. This was legacy. In quiet evenings inside my restored home, I reflected on respect, on privilege unearned, and on the myth that blood excuses betrayal. Family does not require blindness. Unconditional forgiveness given to toxicity is simply surrender. Spencer and Delilah mistook patience for weakness. They believed love would shield them from consequence. They forgot who built the foundation. Money does not alter character. It magnifies it. It magnified cruelty. It magnified cowardice. And it magnified my resolve. I do not regret summoning federal agents. I do not regret witnessing consequence. Justice was not vengeance. It was restoration. And now what truly mattered stood secure. I took another slow sip of the premium bourbon, letting the absolute unbroken stillness of the evening wash over me. For the first time in 5 years, I was completely, totally, and beautifully alone in my own home, and it was absolutely perfect. The Monday morning after the federal judge delivered his harsh sentencing, I did not stay home to rest in my quiet, restored mansion. I woke up at 5 o'clock in the morning, put on my sharpest custom-tailored navy blue suit, and drove myself downtown to the massive glass tower of Vaughn Logistics. For 8 long months, I had played the role of a fading, senile old man, shuffling through the corporate hallways, while my son and his toxic wife bled my life's work entirely dry. But as I walked through the heavy glass doors of the main lobby that morning, the entire atmosphere of the building completely shifted. The security guard stood up perfectly straight, nodding with deep respect. The receptionist smiled with genuine, profound relief. The hard-working employees who had been terrified of losing their pensions under Spencer's incompetent leadership looked at me like a massive dark storm cloud had finally cleared away from the sky. I walked directly into the executive boardroom, where the senior vice presidents and regional managers were nervously waiting for my arrival. I sat down at the head of the long, polished mahogany table. I did not give a long, dramatic speech or talk about the massive federal scandal that had just rocked our foundation. I simply looked at the men and women who had helped me build this logistics empire from the ground up, and I told them that the vacation was officially over, and it was time to get back to real, honest work. We spent the next 3 months aggressively repairing the massive financial damage Delilah and Spencer had caused. We recovered the stolen offshore assets. We stabilized the damaged vendor contracts, and we personally called and rehired every single honest truck driver and mechanic my son had wrongfully terminated. I walked the freight yards again, smelling the familiar thick scent of diesel fuel and fresh asphalt. I shook hands with the men loading the trailers. The logistics empire was completely secure again, and it was running smoother and more profitably than it ever had before. But simply restoring the corporate balance sheet was not enough for my soul. When you survive a massive, devastating betrayal that rocks the very foundation of your own family, you quickly realize that true legacy is not just about accumulating endless wealth. It is about exactly whose hands you choose to leave that wealth in. I looked at my son, Spencer, a boy who grew up with absolute luxury and absolute privilege, and I saw how I had let greed and country club entitlement turn him into a federal criminal. I realized I had given him far too much and expected far too little in return. I was not going to make that exact same mistake with my hard-earned fortune ever again. So I took $5 million of my own personal capital, and I officially established a massive educational trust. I named it the Yvonne Vaughn Memorial Scholarship Fund. I set it up specifically to provide full academic scholarships and comprehensive business grants for young, hard-working Black children from the exact same struggling city neighborhoods where my beautiful Yvonne and I grew up. I wanted to find the kids who had real grit. I wanted to find the young students who were eating cold, cheap sandwiches on crowded city buses, reading borrowed library textbooks, and dreaming of building their own massive empires one day. I wanted to give my wealth to young men and women who actually understood the profound value of a hard-earned dollar instead of an arrogant son who thought money was just a cheap tool to impress his toxic, condescending wife. I remember handing the very first scholarship check to a brilliant young girl who wanted to study mechanical engineering. I saw the tears of genuine gratitude in her parents' eyes, and I immediately thought about the fake, manipulative tears Richard and Susan had cried in my office. The contrast was absolutely staggering. When I signed the final legal documents to officially launch the foundation, I looked at a framed photograph of Yvonne sitting on my heavy wooden desk. I knew she was looking down at me with a beautiful, proud smile. We were finally investing our legacy into people who actually deserved to inherit it. Sitting in my quiet, restored mansion during the long, peaceful evenings, I have had a lot of time to reflect on the true value of respect, the corrupting nature of unearned money, and the absolute limits of family ties. Society constantly tells us that blood is thicker than water. We are conditioned from a very young age to believe that because we brought a child into this world, we must endure absolutely any level of disrespect, manipulation, or abuse they choose to throw at us. We are told that a good father always forgives and forgets. But I learned the incredibly hard way that offering unconditional forgiveness to a truly toxic person is just handing them a loaded weapon and apologizing when they shoot you with it. Spencer and Delilah thought my old age made me weak and helpless. They thought the natural love I had for my only son would completely blind me to the millions of dollars they were actively stealing right under my nose. They mistook my patient calculating silence for senility. They simply did not understand that a man who can build a massive corporate empire from the dirt up possesses a level of ruthless survival instinct that a spoiled, entitled child could never possibly comprehend. Money is just a magnifying glass. It does not change who you really are deep down inside. It only magnifies exactly what is already hiding in your heart. It gave Delilah the power to show her true, cruel, manipulative nature. It gave Spencer the comfort to display his absolute pathetic cowardice. And it gave me the exact heavy tools I needed to completely dismantle their fake aristocratic world and lock them all in federal concrete boxes. I do not regret calling the federal agents that night. I do not regret sitting in that cold, sterile interrogation room and looking my weeping son in the eye and telling him I was there to watch him pay the heavy price for his betrayal. Sometimes the most loving thing a parent can actually do is step completely out of the way and let the heavy concrete consequences of reality crush the blinding arrogance out of their child. I found my true absolute peace the exact moment I accepted that I cannot buy solid character for my son, and I cannot save a man who actively chooses to tie an anchor around his own neck and drown. I sit on my back porch now, watching the golden sunset over the manicured green lawns. The air is warm and perfectly still. There are no more fake socialite parties in my grand foyer. There are no more hushed arguments about offshore accounts or country club memberships. There is only the quiet, deep satisfaction of a life completely rebuilt and a family legacy violently protected. The fortune I built, hauling heavy freight through freezing rain and endless sleepless nights, will no longer be squandered on designer bags or illegal gambling debts. It will build schools. It will fund community centers. It will create an entire generation of strong, educated, independent young people who will never let anyone throw a glass of wine in their face. I look back at that Easter dinner, not with anger, but with profound, beautiful clarity. That single glass of dark red wine was the ultimate catalyst for the greatest cleansing of my entire life. It washed away the toxic illusions. It revealed the absolute ugly truth hiding at my table, and it allowed me to finally reclaim the throne I had foolishly stepped away from. You can only be betrayed by the people you choose to trust. That's the hardest truth in any family betrayal. I stopped confusing blood with loyalty, and I started protecting what I built with discipline instead of emotion. The empire stands, the boundaries are firm, and this family story ends with dignity intact. Too many parents endure silent humiliation in the name of love. Too many people excuse family betrayal because they're still family. But a powerful family story teaches something different. Respect is not optional, character cannot be purchased, and forgiveness does not rebuild a rotten foundation. If this family betrayal story resonated with you, if this family story reminded you to guard your peace, then stand tall, protect your legacy, and never let anyone make you feel small in the empire you created. Thank you for being part of this family story. If you believe strength sometimes means walking away from family betrayal, like this video, and subscribe for more powerful family stories. And tell me in the comments, have you ever had to choose your peace over blood?